Hello and welcome to the Teach English Online Head Start course. And first of all, let me thank you for deciding to take this course and giving me the opportunity to help you to become an online English language teacher. And I just wanted to say a quick note on that. Even though we're focusing on this course on online teaching, the majority of the things that we're going to talk about here are also applicable to classroom teaching, just with some minor adjustments. So by going through this course, you'll also be in a much better position to teach face-to-face classes also, not just online classes. And I decided to call this the Head Start course because instead of trying to teach you every single thing that you need to know and end up with a 40-hour course, I've tried to give you what you need to get started as an English teacher. The core concepts, the core methods that you need to get up and running, working online and earning as an English language teacher. So I've broken the course down into these sections. So we're going to start in the introduction, the first steps, and we're going to answer these two really important questions. So we're going to answer this question: what is teaching? If we're going to be a teacher, if we're going to work as a teacher, it's really important that we understand what that means. What does it really mean to teach somebody? If you can understand what you're doing in greater detail, it will just make you better at your job. And in the same way, we're going to be working with people, with human beings. So we need to understand what these people, our students, are going through. We need to be able to put ourselves in their shoes and understand the process from their point of view. So therefore, we're going to ask and answer the question, what is learning? What is this process that we call learning? Because if we can understand this better, it will put us in a much better position to be able to plan our lesson with these things in mind. And that gives us a really good foundation then to go on into the rest of the course. And after this, we're going to move into the section here that I've called your toolbox. Because what I'm going to try to do here is give you the most important techniques that I think you need to be able to manage a class. And by that, I mean to control the lesson, to be able to deal with problems as they come up, to be able to introduce things correctly, to really guide your student through the lesson. So this isn't about the lesson materials, it's about how you, as the teacher, manage the lesson. So in this section, we're going to talk about these things. So we're going to talk about TTT and STT. You will understand in great detail what this means. Pre-teaching, eliciting, concept checking, error correction, and then finally, we're going to focus on giving instructions. If you can get to grips with this relatively small list of skills and methods here, you're in a really strong position to be able to manage your lessons successfully. But then if we have these techniques, we need a lesson to manage. So what we're going to do then, we're going to go through and we're going to plan a lesson together. Instead of just talking about theory and why we do things in the lesson, let's actually do it. So we're going to take a worksheet and I'm going to take you through step by step the process that I would go through to plan a lesson based on that worksheet. It's not so that you can use this worksheet specifically, but just to show you the steps that you go through to prepare and plan a lesson successfully. And the first thing we're going to talk about here in this section is PPP. Now, you will become very familiar with this as the course goes on. Then we'll move into our warmer, which is an optional part of the lesson, but I think really important. And then we're going to go through a section on checking our material. So before a lesson, you're going to have different material that you will use, maybe video, audio, worksheets. It's really important before the lesson to check through the material so you understand it correctly. And also decide how you're going to use that material to help your student learn in the lesson. If we understand our material really well, we can then plan our lesson based on that material. And then we're going to walk through planning the main stages of our lesson here. So the presentation, practice, and production stages of the lesson. PPP, presentation, practice, production. This is a really effective way to break down your lesson so you're going to help your student to achieve their language learning goal in the lesson. And as we're doing this, we're going to write our ideas down in real detail so you can clearly see not only what we do, but why we do the things that we do in the lesson. And then we're going to take all those ideas and I'm going to help you to condense them down so that we can put them on a lesson plan. We're going to condense everything down into like bullet points. So you've got a lesson plan that you can have on your desk during the lesson that's clear and easy to follow. And on top of that, we're also going to decide how to use our screen. So we're going to be in a lesson, in an online lesson with a student, you're going to be sharing information with them. So like our screen is kind of like the blackboard or the whiteboard in a classroom. And it's really important to plan how you're going to use that space to display information correctly and clearly to the student. So we're also going to break that down. So for every stage of our lesson, we're also going to think about how to do that. How do we display this information clearly for the student? And here we have more to come because this course is new and the core of the course is finished. But what I'm going to do as the weeks and the months go on, I'm going to be adding more content to this course. Please tell me what you enjoy about the course, what's useful for you, and also tell me maybe what was confusing, what you think's missing from the course. And I will add more content to the course as time goes on. Feel free to contact me at any time. If you have any questions about anything in the course, I'll be happy to help you and I will always reply to your messages. Now that we have a really clear idea of where we're headed in the course, let's move on and continue and let's start to think about this question. What is teaching? So now that we've established what to expect from the course, let's talk a little bit about who this course is for. So this course is for someone who wants to teach online, and specifically we're talking about teaching a language online, but doesn't have any qualifications or experience. So you're starting from absolute zero, but you've decided that this is the path you want to follow. So this course will give you everything you need to get started on that path. This course would also benefit current teachers, current online teachers specifically, who started without any training and you've been trying to figure things out for yourself and maybe you've been struggling, finding it quite difficult. Maybe a lot of the things that we'll talk about in this course you already know, but I'm pretty sure you will find a lot of useful things that maybe you haven't thought about before. We all need help from other people. Throughout my teaching career, I have taken so many things from other teachers. Other teachers, when I saw them, I realized that they were doing maybe certain things in a better way than I was, maybe things I'd never even thought about. So I took little bits from many, many teachers. So I'm sure in this course you'll find a few things that you can use to help you in your career. It's also for people wanting a way just out of the traditional work life. I think a lot of people these days are getting tired Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, whatever your set hours are, but going to the same place every day, sitting in the same location every day. Teaching online is a fantastic way to break out of that cycle. And also, more and more people these days want to travel and live overseas. And I think traditionally, a lot of people would save up money, go backpacking, and then come home, maybe broke, spent all your money. But teaching a language is a fantastic way to travel and earn as you travel. To teach online, all you need is an internet connection. If you have a good internet connection, you can teach in a cafe in Bangkok. You can teach from the beach. You can teach from the balcony in your hotel room. So once you've learned the basic skills that will allow you to get started on this path, the world will open up to you. And also this course would be good for anyone who's just interested in the idea of teaching English or teaching any language online. Maybe you're not sure if it's a path you want to follow, or maybe you don't know if you can do it. And by working your way through this course, you'll get a much better understanding if this is a career you want to pursue. And anybody can do this. I guarantee you from experience, there's nothing special or magical about a teacher. If you put in the time, learn the basic techniques, you can be a successful teacher. If we're going to be teachers, we're going to follow this career path. I think it's important to understand and to think about, what does that mean? What does it mean to teach? What is teaching? Now, before we get into what teaching is, let's maybe eliminate some of the things that teaching isn't, and some of the things we shouldn't do when we're teaching. So teaching isn't just giving out instructions. I remember when I think back to high school, I remember so many of my high school teachers pretty much just did this in every class. They would walk into the class, tell us which page to open, tell us which exercise to do, and give us a time limit. That isn't teaching. Anybody can do that. You don't need any training. Anybody can walk into a classroom and give out instructions. That isn't teaching. And teaching isn't just pointing out where students make mistakes, just telling them which questions they got wrong. Not only can this be demoralizing, but it's just not effective. Now, we're going to cover this in a later section. This is related to error correction. But this definitely isn't what teaching is about. And teaching also isn't just giving students the answers. So they will make many mistakes, they will get many questions wrong, but just giving them the correct answer is completely ineffective and will never help them to learn. Now, this last point is based on my experience, just a mistake that I made at the beginning of my career. I had this idea that I had to walk into the classroom and that my goal was to entertain the student. I was terrified of the students being bored or at least looking bored in the class. But this is not what teaching is. You're not there to entertain the students. You're there to engage the students, but that is very different from entertaining. So now that we've thought about what teaching isn't, I think it's a good time for you to pause the video, get a pen and a notepad or open your laptop, write your own definition, maybe one sentence that you think describes what teaching is. What is this process that we're going to be doing for a job? So pause the video now and try to write your own definition of teaching. So how did you do? Let's take a look at what I think teaching is. Now remember, this is just my opinion. I'm sure if you asked 100 teachers, they might give you a different definition. But I would say this. Teaching is guiding students so that they can discover as much as possible for themselves. It's really that simple. As a teacher, your main job is a guide. You're guiding the students through the lesson. It's not your job to point them exactly in the direction they need to go, but you're just there to just keep them on track. If they get off track, you help them to get back on track. You're not there to tell them exactly where to go, because as we'll talk about in a later video, if they can discover things for themselves, they're far more likely to retain that information. Now, in the same way that we just talked about what it means to be a teacher, it's also important to remember that there are other people involved in this process, the students. And for the students, it isn't about teaching. For the students, it's about learning. So it's also important to understand, at least think about, what it means to learn. What is that process that we call learning? And I thought the best way to talk about this was give you two examples. So we could see here in picture A, somebody's using what looks like Google Maps. So I assume this person is in a location where they don't know exactly where to go, so they're using Google Maps to find their way. And in picture B, we have a similar situation. Somebody's trying to find the way to a particular location, but they're using a traditional map, a paper map. And before we go any further, if we're thinking about learning, and we're specifically thinking about the long-term effects, the long-term benefits, which of these two methods of finding your way do you think will be the most effective? If you're going to take the same route today, tomorrow, the day after, which of these two people is more likely to be able to remember that route more quickly? Now we'll come back to this a little bit later. So if we think about the process that each of these people is going to go through, so the person in picture A, the person who's using Google Maps, they don't have to figure anything out. All they have to do is type their destination in the search bar, and the application does everything for them. They can even orient themselves by just turning around. Their phone will tell them exactly which way they are facing, if they're going in the right direction or not. So they're given all the information. There is absolutely nothing that they need to get, nothing they need to find out or discover. And maybe because of this, because you're just given all the information and there's nothing that you need to find out, you're probably not going to be very engaged in the task. I could very easily use Google Maps while having a conversation with somebody, or drinking a coffee, or walking down the street. It doesn't really take a lot of your attention. And I guess because of all these things together, if you're using Google Maps, and specifically the person in this picture, in picture A, they're not going to encounter any challenges. It's just plain sailing. You start at location A and you get to location B, and the phone does everything for you. If you get lost, you can just check your current location. You don't have to think at all. And because of this, because everything's done for you, you're not pushing yourself. You're going to feel really comfortable. Even if you're in a foreign country, in a new city that you've never been to before, it's unlikely that you're going to get lost. Wherever you end up, you're going to be able to use Google Maps or a similar application. Maybe you have an iPhone, you could use Apple Maps, and you're never going to get lost. You're always going to feel comfortable that you can find your way either to your destination or maybe back to your hotel. Now let's think about the process that the person in picture B is going to go through. Now this person has to figure things out for themselves. This is a piece of paper. This is a paper map. It cannot do anything. It's just a 2D representation of a location. There's no search bar. There's no GPS. You have to figure out how to use the map. You even have to figure out where you are on the map before you can even think about getting to your destination. And because of this, you have to be aware and you have to be observant. You have to observe your surroundings. Pay attention to where you are so you can locate yourself on the map. And because you're figuring things out by yourself and you're having to look around in your environment, and especially if this is a new location, you are absolutely going to encounter challenges. Maybe you can't even figure out where you are on the map at the beginning. And even though this might be difficult, it's going to make you engaged in the task. You're not going to be doing this while casually chatting to somebody or walking down the street. If you're using a map and you're walking around, you'll probably find a place to stop where you can put the map down and take a closer look and figure out where you are. And compared to picture one, if you get lost and you just have a paper map, it might be a little uncomfortable because you really could get lost, and it's up to you. Maybe with the help of some other people, you can ask for directions, but it's up to you to figure this out. So you're going to feel a bit uncomfortable. Maybe you're out of your comfort zone. Now let's go back to what I asked you at the beginning. So let's imagine these two people are navigating a route for the first time, but they're going to follow this same route day after day after day. Which of these two people is more likely to be able to remember this route? Maybe person B loses their map, and maybe person A loses their phone, but they still need to navigate this route. Who's going to be able to navigate this route more effectively? My guess, and based on my experience, is that when the person in picture A doesn't have their phone, they're going to be lost because they didn't pay any attention when they were making the journey. They didn't figure anything out for themselves. They were given all the answers. They're going to be completely lost. The person in picture B, even though they may have struggled more at the beginning, maybe on the first day it took them a long time to find the destination, much more quickly they're going to be able to remember this route because they're doing everything for themselves. They're challenging themselves, they're engaged in the task, and they're pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. And this to me is at the heart of what effective learning is. So with that in mind, and thinking back to what we did with our definition for teaching, let's think about what is learning. What would be a good definition for this process? Now pause the video again and try to think of your own definition for learning. And use the previous exercise to help you. Think about what did we just talk about with the person using Google Maps versus the person using the paper map. I'll give you a few minutes, pause the video, and then when we come back, we'll look at a definition that I found that I think is an excellent definition for what learning is. So I cheated a little bit here. I didn't write my own definition, but I found a definition online that I think is extremely accurate. So this definition tells us that learning is a process that leads to change, which occurs as a result of experience and increases the potential of improved performance and future learning. Now let's take a moment to read that again and really maybe break it down a little bit. So the first thing we see here in this definition is that learning is a process. That's a really important thing to remember. I think a lot of people always want the quick fix. You know, I'm going to learn a language in 1 month or 2 months. That's not how it works. Learning is a process, and a gradual process that often takes a long time. But if that process works correctly, this will lead to some change. And the change here that we're looking for is that you've acquired a new skill. You've become better at doing something. You've acquired more knowledge. And the only way that we can use this process to get the desired change, the result, is through experience. Like we talked about in the previous exercise, the person with the map, pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. And if you do this, the change will be improved performance. And as you go through this process and you start to understand how learning works, you'll become better at learning. So your future learning will also be improved. And you should keep this in mind when you're teaching, because you've got to understand things not only from your point of view, but also from the learner, from the student's point of view. Okay, and welcome to the next part of the course. So you may have noticed that this section is called Your Toolbox. And what we're going to do here, just like in other professions, like a mechanic has a toolbox, an artist, a painter has a toolbox, a set of things, a set of skills that you need to be successful in your job, a language teacher also needs a toolbox. So we're going to go through this section and we're going to build up your toolbox. So let's have a look at what's going to be inside your language teaching toolbox. First, we're going to talk about TTT and STT. Now, don't worry if you don't know what these are right now, because we're going to go into much more detail about what they are in the coming videos. And then we're going to talk about pre-teaching. After pre-teaching, the third thing we're going to talk about is eliciting. After eliciting, we're going to go into concept checking. After concept checking, we'll take a look at error correction. And then finally in this section, we'll look at giving instructions. So even though earlier in the course I said that teaching isn't about giving instructions, it's inevitable that at some point we will have to give instructions. And there's a right way to do this, and there's a wrong way to do this. Now, just take a look at this list. It's really not that big. We have 6 things here. Now, these are the core techniques that you need to keep in mind in order to be an effective language teacher and to deliver your lessons correctly. Now, just because this is a short list, it doesn't mean these are easy. These are actually quite difficult to get right and also to put them all together in the lesson. But with time, you will be able to do this. Let's move on to the next video, where we're going to look at TTT and STT. So let's talk about the first item in our toolbox, our first tool. Now, if you remember, if you think back to our list, it was TTT and STT. So what are these? What exactly is TTT and STT? Well, it's not that complicated. TTT stands for Teacher Talk Time, and I think you can probably guess, STT stands for Student Talk Time. Now, this might be something that you've never thought about before, but it's important. It's important that we think about how much the teacher should be talking and how much the student should be talking during the different stages of our lesson and as our lesson develops. And as we go into the first part of the lesson, which will be the presentation part of the lesson, And don't worry if you don't know this yet, but we're going to cover it in detail in later videos. But think of the presentation section as like the intro, the beginning of your lesson. Now, during this stage, it's the teacher that should be talking the most. The teacher talk time should be at its peak. And here, the students are going to be giving very little. You're still going to want something from your students, but it's going to be very simple output from your students at this stage. And then as we move into the next stage of the lesson, which we will call the practice stage, and for now, just think of this as like this is the midpoint in the lesson. And here, what we want is for the teacher talk time and the student talk time to be more balanced. The teacher wants to be stepping back a little bit and expecting the students to produce more, to give more input in the lesson. And as we move into the final stage of the lesson, we want the teacher now to be taking a back seat and talking as little as possible. Here, the teacher's input should just be to guide the students, maybe if they get stuck. But you want to be speaking as little as possible at this stage in the lesson. And we want the students to be now taking over. This is their time to practice, to produce what they've learned in the lesson. And we want them to be speaking the most here. So at the beginning of the lesson, we want the teacher to be talking more than the students. And as the lesson progresses, we slowly hand more and more control over to the students. So by the end of the lesson, in the production stage, the students should have taken control and be speaking the most. And it's important to get this right because we have to remember that the teacher doesn't need to practice their native language. The students are the ones who need to talk. They're the ones who need to practice. And if you can keep this in mind, when to have more teacher talk time and when to have more student talk time, you will create an effective learning environment. So now let's talk about the next item in our toolbox, which is pre-teaching. And to do this, I'm going to use some real-world material, so things that I would actually use in a lesson. So here on the left of the screen here, we have this video, and on the right of the screen, we have this worksheet. Now, I would have sent these materials to my student about 10 minutes before the lesson begins. I wouldn't send them a long time in advance because when I've done that in the past, I get to the lesson and I find the student has already completed the worksheet and the work is finished before the lesson's even begun. So you can be left with 60 minutes of a lesson and the material has already been completed. So yeah, send them to the students in advance, but 5 to 10 minutes before the lesson starts. So what I'll do now, I'll just play you the introduction to this video so you can get an idea of the content that we're dealing with before we get into what pre-teaching is and how we do it.
Hello, and welcome to Live from London, brought to you by One Stop English. Today we're in Brixton, and we're asking people about first impressions.
Okay, so let's stop the video there. So as you can see, this video is about a specific topic. And in fact, every video in this series is about a specific topic. And just one point I'd like to mention, actually, let's just go back here. If you're going to take teaching seriously, you're going to do this as a profession. You're going to spend a lot of time creating materials, planning lessons. And at the beginning of your career, that can actually be quite challenging. As you're learning how to be a teacher, it's much more difficult to create your materials. So I would recommend using something like this. This is One Stop English. If you search for them on Google, you'll find One Stop English. They have hundreds and hundreds of amazing lesson materials, some of them complete lesson plans like this. This series is called Live from London. Each one comes with a video and a worksheet already made for you. What I usually do is take the worksheet and I make some changes to it just to adapt it to my style of teaching. But I highly recommend doing something like this. There will be a section later in the course about resources and where to go and get lesson materials. Some places you can find free resources, but others are paid. So One Stop English is actually a paid site. You need to pay to get access to their materials, but it's extremely worthwhile. Their materials are really professional and I highly recommend them. Saved me hundreds of hours in lesson preparation time. So getting back to what we were talking about, in this video there's a topic, the topic is introduced, and then the student is going to watch a group of people being interviewed and they're talking about a specific topic. In this case, about first impressions. And the student will usually watch the video several times during the lesson. Each time they watch it, they're working through a different part of the worksheet. So let's say we're looking at this section here, the true or false section. What do you think is going to happen if you just tell the student here, we're going to do the true or false section here. You need to look at these sentences and decide whether they're true or false, and then you just press play on the video. Now, maybe to make it easier for you to think about it, imagine whatever your native language is. Let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, that your native language is English and you're in the middle of a Japanese lesson. And the Japanese teacher just gives you this exercise. Everything on the worksheet is in Japanese. Everything in the video is in Japanese. And they just say, true or false, watch the video, and then afterwards tell me the answer. How do you think that would be? I think that would be a very difficult and quite overwhelming experience. And let's talk about why. So first of all, let's listen to the first person here in the video. Let's listen to Harry talking. So if we look at here, which sentences are true or which are false? And the process we're going through now is what you should be doing when you're preparing your lessons. So here I'm checking through the material. Okay, so the student's going to listen to this video. They're looking which sentences are true or false. So let's see, Harry first notices people's hair. I'm pretty sure my student's going to know the word hair. If they're doing a worksheet like this, they're likely to be pre-intermediate to intermediate level. So they're going to know the word hair. But let's just find Harry here and let's listen to what Harry says in answer to this question.
First notice about someone when you meet them.
When they walk in the room.
Yeah.
I don't know, probably their sort of like attitude. That's the first thing that I noticed.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did Harry say about this? He first notices their attitude. So I'm not sure that my student's going to understand this word. So what I want to do is give them a chance to understand this word or to become at least familiar with this word before I give them this exercise. So I'm going to make a note of this. Now remember that this is in the planning stage of the lesson here. So this is me or you as the teacher the day before the lesson, planning your lesson in advance. So we've decided attitude is a word that needs a bit of attention. So let's look at the second thing here. Harry takes after his father. Already there, takes after. Are they going to know what takes after means? And I'm not going to play all of this video, but in his answer, Harry says, I get it from my mother. So already there we have takes after and get it from. So I would make a note of this because I think it's quite important to get it from somebody. And then if we move on to Robbie, Robbie first notices if people are friendly and smiley. His answer actually includes these words, friendly and smiley. So when we listen to Robbie speaking, he says friendly and smiley. So at this level, I think my students are going to know these words. And then Robbie again. Robbie asks a lot of questions when he first meets someone. I'm not worried about this. I am 99% sure they're going to know questions a lot. I don't think they will have trouble with this. And in his answer, he doesn't give any more difficult words. Lorraine thinks people first notice that she's funny. Well, funny, I'd have no problem with that. But if we listen to Lorraine's answer, she says bubbly. Now, I don't know how many of my students would be familiar with the word bubbly, especially in the context of a person when you're using it as an adjective to describe a person. So I would make a note of bubbly. And then again, here we look at the next one. Harry thinks people first notice his voice. I would be confident at this level they would know voice. But in his answer, he uses the word pan, like connected to deadpan, as in a deadpan comedian, like monotone. I would be amazed at this level if they understood what the word pan or deadpan meant. So I would make a note of that also. Now, you'll have to forgive me with this man's name. I've never figured out how to pronounce it, so let's call him Mr. R. He thinks people first notice his eyes. I think this is okay. The student should know this word. And in the answer, he talks about his height and how tall he is. I'm not going to worry about this vocabulary. Robbie says he often stops talking. Now, again, this is a problem with the answer. I think my student's going to understand this sentence. But in the answer, he says he talks non-stop. This is 50-50 for me. I think my students will be able to make sense of this, but I just want to double check because we have it here. He doesn't say I don't stop talking. He says I talk non-stop. So I would rather check this just to be on the safe side. And then underneath here we have Lorraine hopes people feel she's a genuine person. You know, I don't know. Genuine. I think this is a bit more of an advanced word. So I would make a note of this, especially using this word when describing a person, a genuine person, not a genuine product, as opposed to a fake product. I would add genuine to my list. And then here at the end, so I'm going to leave this in here because this is a good example. When you make your own materials, and even when you get materials or pre-made materials from a site like One Stop English, it's a very good idea to check through them because you might find some mistakes. And if you can find some mistakes before your lesson, that's a good time to find them. So in the planning process of your lessons here, when you're going through making your pre-teaching list, hopefully you will spot these things. So the first thing, let's change this K to a G. Robbie noticed about his best friend was her eyes. Now, I'm pretty certain that my students are going to know at this level what the word eyes means. And in his answer, he doesn't give anything more complicated. He talks about her eyes. So there we have it. We've gone through the material that our student is going to be given in order to be able to complete this exercise. We've had a look in advance and put ourselves in the student's place. And we've picked out some words that we think might be a little bit problematic for our student. Now, again, imagine if we just don't do this and we just throw this exercise at our student and they're hearing these words, attitude, pan, bubbly, genuine. They're not going to know what any of this means, or at least most of them won't know what this means. So this is why we do this. We've got to think ahead and think what it's like to be our student. Remember, our job as a teacher is to break everything down, and we're kind of giving it back to our student. We're giving the building blocks back to our students so they can put the blocks back together in order to complete these exercises. Now, what I would do, what I recommend doing here is once you have this list, especially because you're teaching online and this is much easier, I would now send this list of words to my student at least the day before the lesson and tell your student that they need to check these words before the lesson begins. That way, you give your student a bit of advance warning, you allow them to prepare as best they can for the lesson, and when you come to check the meaning of these words, before you give these exercises, you're going to save yourself some time in the lesson. Imagine you just suddenly start to go through these in the lesson and everything is new to your student. You can do it, but it's much better to give them some time before the lesson to check the meaning of this vocabulary for themselves. Now, we've decided which words, which vocabulary we need to pre-teach. But now the question is, how do we do this? When we actually get to the lesson now and our students hopefully check these words in the dictionary, they've looked online, how do we now check whether the student understands these or not? How do we explain the meaning of these words to our student if our student doesn't speak English fluently? And we are certainly not going to use the student's native language. Well, to do that, we need to use the next item in our toolbox, which is eliciting. Now let's move on to the next item in our toolbox. But before we talk about eliciting, what it is and how we do it, let's think about this question. How can we get students to produce vocabulary in the classroom? In this situation, we've decided the vocabulary that we need to pre-teach. We sent that vocabulary to our student the day before the lesson, and now you're in the lesson with the student and you want to check whether the student knows this vocabulary, whether they can produce this vocabulary. But you can't manipulate their minds, you can't magically get them to say these words. And even if they do say these words, they could have just memorized the sound of the words. You could give me a list of 10 Hindi words. I don't speak any Hindi, but I could memorize the sounds and I could repeat the sounds, but that doesn't tell you whether I understand the words or not. Well, let's go through two different situations. First, let's think about a classroom lesson where the teacher, as in this picture here, is in the same space, in the same room as the students. And this teacher has given his students this target vocabulary. We have run, walk, climb, jump, crawl. I've simplified the vocabulary here just while we're going through the process of understanding what eliciting is. But now in the lesson, before the teacher gives his students an exercise to work on, he wants to make sure that his students understand these words, that they've prepared for the lesson. Take a minute to think about this. If you were this teacher now, and you want to go through these words and see if your students understood these words, not just if they've memorized how to say these words, what would you do? How could you do that? Pause the video and just take a minute or so to think about what you as the teacher could do to get this vocabulary from your students. So how did you do? What ideas did you think of? For me, in this situation, and especially with this more simple vocabulary, these are all verbs, so these are all things we can do with our body. I would use body language. I would use my body. I would physically represent these words to the students. And don't forget that these students have been given this vocabulary before the lesson started. I would just run on the spot, or I would run around the classroom. Now, you have to build up your confidence doing these things. The first time you do it, you might feel foolish and maybe the students don't know what you're doing. But eventually one of them will put their hand up or they will say run. They will understand. At the beginning, it might take a bit of time. Then you walk and hopefully one of them will say walk. You can pretend you're climbing up the wall and they will say climb. So in this way, you can get the vocabulary from your students. In an emergency situation here, where if it becomes apparent that the students simply haven't prepared for the lesson, what you can do is use the same technique to teach these words. You can write the word run on the board and then mime running, pretend you're running. Point the word out to the students, connect it to the action. Do the same with walk, do the same with climb. Get them to repeat the words while you're doing the action. And then once you've gone through them, randomly go through these. Jump on the spot and get them to say jump. Walk and get them to say walk. So in this situation, it's fairly simple for the teacher to elicit this vocabulary from the students. You're not asking them to repeat after you. You're doing something that is encouraging the students to produce this vocabulary. And this is eliciting. Let's change this now. With the same target vocabulary, run, walk, climb, jump, and crawl. But now we're in an online lesson. So you're no longer in the same space as the student. So this is your student here sitting at the desk. And this is you on the screen. This is you, the teacher. Like we did before, I want you to pause the video and think about how you would do this. Because body language is difficult online. If you stand up and start using your body to show these actions in an online setting, it might look a bit strange to the student. They might not be able to see you from head to toe to see what you're doing. You're left really after that with facial expressions, and it would be very difficult to show crawl with your face or climb with your face. Some things, if you're doing emotions, you might be able to use facial expressions, but even then it's quite challenging. Pause the video and just take a few minutes to think, maybe make some notes. What could you do as the teacher to check whether this student understands these words, and how could you get this student to produce these words without simply getting them to repeat after you, because anybody can repeat words, even if we don't understand them. Okay, so what did you think of? What ways did you think of to elicit this vocabulary from your student? What I would do in this situation, because we are online, I don't know whether you're going to be using Skype or Zoom, Google Hangouts. You might be teaching using a platform like italki or Verbling. With all of these, you have the ability to share images, to share video, to share any materials in real time with your student. So before the lesson, you need to plan, get some materials, get some images, and we can simply share these images with our student. So instead of miming the actions with our body, we can simply show some images. So here we have somebody running. So this is for run. We have walk, climb, jump, crawl. It's actually fairly simple. It's still a very clear visual representation. And you're doing this without telling the student what the word is, and you're encouraging them to produce the vocabulary. You're eliciting this from them. And to make it more interesting, again, because we're online, you can even use short video clips. I'm never sure whether it's GIF or GIF, but you can go online places like Giphy, or in that case, it might be Jiffy. You can get lots of clips to help you to make it a bit more interesting for your student. But we've done the same thing here that we would have done being physically present in the classroom with the student. We've just been a bit more creative and used the technology at our disposal to elicit this vocabulary from the student. And now let's just talk a bit about why we do this. What's the purpose of eliciting vocabulary? Because if you think back to the example we had at the beginning of this course, where we compared somebody using Google Maps to somebody using a real map, by eliciting, you're not telling the student the answers. You're not giving them all the information. You're encouraging them to find things out for themselves. And in the process, you're challenging them. You're forcing them to dig into their memory to recall this vocabulary. And therefore, the student is going to be more involved and focused. This will in turn give them a sense of satisfaction that they've pulled out. And don't forget, this is in a foreign language. Every achievement is fantastic in a foreign language. They've managed to pull this vocabulary out, and they've produced it without you telling them what to say. In turn, this is going to lead to motivation. They're going to feel great that they're managing to produce this vocabulary in a foreign language and in what might be quite a nerve-wracking setting in a live lesson with a native speaker. Or maybe not a native speaker, but somebody who speaks the language fluently, well enough to teach it. There are, however, a few things that you need to be careful of when using this technique. Don't push it. If you've already used an image, you've used body language, maybe you used a few different images and the student still isn't producing this vocabulary, don't push it. You can just make the student nervous, uncomfortable, and start to feel stressed, and that will adversely affect their performance. Because if they don't know it, they just don't know it. Now, this could be because they didn't prepare for the lesson correctly, or it might be, and I would say this is more often the case, you just get nervous. Whenever I have to speak a foreign language, it's much easier to feel nervous when you're speaking in a foreign language, and I very often forget simple words. And in this case, there's no point pushing them. You have to decide as the teacher, when is the time to stop, move on, and maybe come back again later. And you could also cause your student to feel frustrated if you haven't properly thought about your student's level. Are you giving your student vocabulary that's too difficult? Are you expecting them to produce things that are just simply above their level of ability? It's up to you as the teacher when planning your lessons and deciding which vocabulary to pre-teach. It's up to you to be aware of your student's level and your student's ability. You do not want to be overwhelming your student with vocabulary that is too complicated, because we get the opposite effect. They're going to become demotivated and they're going to doubt their ability in using the language. In the previous video, we talked about eliciting and how we can use it to help pre-teach key vocabulary, target vocabulary to our students. But we don't just use eliciting at that stage of the lesson. Eliciting is something you can and should use throughout your lessons. And in this video, I want to think about other ways that we can use eliciting during the lesson. Now let's imagine this situation. You're in the lesson and your student is speaking and they get stuck on a word. What do you do? Now at this stage, you might know what your student is going to say. You're pretty sure you know the word that they're trying to think of. Well, don't just tell them the word. We know that. We should never just give the student the answer. But why? Think back to our previous videos. Why shouldn't we just help the student out here to avoid maybe an uncomfortable situation where the student is struggling? Why shouldn't we just tell them the answer? Because wherever possible, we should encourage the student to find things out for themselves. This keeps them engaged in the task and they are far more likely to remember the vocabulary if they figure it out for themselves. How do we do this though? How are you going to get your student to complete their sentence? You know what they're going to say. Or most of the time, you know what they're going to say. How can we encourage them, push them towards this word that they're struggling to recollect? Well, we can use eliciting. We can try to elicit the word from our student. Now let's look at how we can do this. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and I've simplified things here just for the sake of explanation. You have to remember everything I am talking about in this course. I have tried to simplify as much as possible to make it easier for you to understand. Not everything that you will come across in your teaching career will be exactly like this. Some things may be much more complicated. Some things may be much easier. But for the sake of making it easier to understand, I have used simple examples. Now look at this picture here. I think probably straight away you know the word that we're going to be talking about. You've given your student a task to use a specific structure. You want them to use this sentence, and you've given them a picture here. You're pretty sure that they know the vocabulary for this picture. We're looking for the word spaghetti. It's something you taught them previously in the lesson, or maybe a previous lesson, and you want them to use it in this sentence. So last night I went to an Italian restaurant and I ate, and they go blank. You've given them the picture. They should know this because you've discussed it before, but they go blank. What can we do? Just think for a few seconds. What can we do now without just telling them spaghetti? How can we get the student to say spaghetti even though they're struggling to recollect the word? We can use eliciting to prompt the student. One of the ways that I often use in my classes is to just give them a little piece of the word. So I will just say this. I'll give them time to think. If they still can't recollect it, I'll say spa. I'm not giving them the answer. I'm just trying to make that connection in their brain, in their memory. If they still can't get it, I'll just add a little bit more. Spag. And I might try it one more time. Add a little bit more spaghetti. And hopefully by this point, they've got it. But if you look at what I'm doing here, I'm just pushing them towards the word. I'm not telling them the word. I'm not directing them exactly. I'm just trying to guide them to the right vocabulary, which in this case is spaghetti. And if they remember the word using this technique, as opposed to me just giving them the answer, it's going to be reinforced in their memory. Every time they recall this word, it will be reinforced. But as we talked about before, we have to be careful with this. Don't push this too far. You don't want to just keep pushing your students spaghetti, because it could become very uncomfortable. And as often happens in the language classroom, your students might be nervous, they might be tired. It doesn't matter how many times you say it. If they've forgotten the word or if they've gone blank, you have to decide as the teacher when is the right point to stop. If you really don't think they're going to get it, as a last resort, you can give them the word. But then what I would do is come back to this later and give them another chance to try to remember this word. And we can use another method online. A second way that we can do this, we have the same sentence, the same structure, and the same picture, and our student has gone blank again. And as we discussed before, we don't want to just give them the answer. Can you think of another way that we could encourage, prompt the student to say this word? How else can we elicit this from the student? Well, another way that I often do this when teaching online, I just type the word to the student, but with some letters missing. Because online, if you have anything like we discussed before, Skype or Zoom, Google Hangouts, you're using italki, you're using Verbling, you can send text messages back and forth with your student. You will have a chat. So I can send the word like this, with some missing letters. Or I could send it like this, or like this. If they can't get it from these clues, from these prompts, maybe you can add an extra letter to help them. And as I did in this example, you can try different combinations of missing letters. Maybe it will be easier for them to recognize it with the SP and then a missing letter instead of the S and then a missing letter before the A. And just like before, if you do it this way and they produce the word, if you elicit the word successfully, there is far more chance that they will retain this word in the future. But I don't mean to labor the point here. Don't push it. Just give them a chance. It's not the end of the world if they can't remember it. As a last resort, you can give them the word. Like I said before, I would then come back to this at the end of the lesson maybe and give them a final chance to try to remember this word. Now let's talk about the next item in our toolbox. But before we get into concept checking and what it is, how we do it, why we do it, I want you to imagine a moment in your class where you've just been giving some instructions to your student. Or maybe you've been pre-teaching or explaining some vocabulary to your student. And you want to check if your student has understood what you have said. Think about this question. Should you use this question to find out if your student has understood what you have said? If they understand the vocabulary or if they understand the instructions? Just take a few seconds to think about this. What kind of response do you think you would get if you ask, do you understand? And how useful the response would be. In my experience, I would give you this advice. You should never ask this question in your lessons. This or similar questions. Do you understand? Is that clear? These are not useful and they won't help you. Now let's talk about why not. Why shouldn't you use a question like, do you understand? So here's our student, and I'm going to keep reminding you about this, but in order to be a good teacher, and I guess not just a language teacher, a teacher of any subject, it's important for us to be able to put ourselves in the student's position. We can sympathize, or even better, we can empathize. I would give you this advice if you're considering being a language teacher. If you have never experienced learning a language, if you have never sat in a language classroom, if you have never tried to speak a foreign language, do it. Do it. Organize it today. Book some lessons. Learn a language, because you need to put yourself in that position. Because in the future, if you have been in that situation and you know what it feels like, it's going to make you a better teacher. And you will understand after doing that students are under pressure in the lesson. It's a difficult situation. You're dealing with a language that you do not understand. It takes away a lot of your ability to explain yourself, to be understood. Everything that you say to your student in the class, everything that's on the worksheet is in a foreign language, a language that they do not understand, or at least do not understand to the level that a native speaker or a fluent speaker understands it. And therefore, every word that they hear, every word that they see, every instruction that you give them, they have to struggle to understand this. It's not automatic in the way that your native language is. And then we throw this question at them. Do you understand? And they're already juggling so many different pieces around in their brain, trying to make sense of everything that you've said. Why might they say yes, even if they haven't understood? Now, not every student will say this. Some students are extremely diligent and will tell you no if they don't understand. But not everybody. Saying yes is just the easy option. It's a way out. If the student's feeling really under pressure, if they're feeling really uncomfortable, maybe they're feeling embarrassed. Some students don't like to admit that they don't understand. Maybe it's a pride thing. So they're going to say yes. It just takes the pressure off them. Oh, yeah, I understand. But this doesn't help us at all. It doesn't help you and it doesn't help the student. If the instruction that you have given is vital for your lesson, if the vocabulary that you've been explaining is vital for your lesson, then as you move forward in the lesson, this lack of understanding is going to affect the lesson. It's going to be detrimental. And this is where concept checking comes in. So let's go through this and talk about how we can use concept checking to avoid this situation, to better understand whether our student has understood what you have been telling them. Here we are back in our classroom situation. This is you again. This is your student sitting at the desk. And as you can see here, we've been pre-teaching some very simple vocabulary. And as I mentioned before, my main goal here is to get you to understand these concepts. So I have simplified the examples as much as possible. But concept checking and eliciting and pre-teaching, these techniques work with the most basic vocabulary and also with the most advanced vocabulary. So it doesn't matter if you're teaching fruit or you're teaching a very complicated grammatical structure. These techniques still apply. So we've been pre-teaching banana, apple, coconut, melon, and peach. And you have noticed that as you've been going through these words, just a few times your student seems to have said peach when you pointed out the picture of the melon, and when you pointed out the picture of the peach, they said melon. Not every time, but it happened a few times, and you're worried that they haven't really understood that this picture represents melon and this picture represents peach. And let's go back to this here. So think about, again, why shouldn't we just say, point this out to them, say, no, this is melon, and I'll use my cursor here. We say, okay, so no, this is melon and this is peach. Okay, do you understand? Is that clear? And the student says, yes. It's no good. We have no idea if they've really understood it. They may just be tired of going through this. They may be confused. And just say yes to get you to move on and give them some space to think, to breathe. So what can we do to find out if they have really understood these words, the association between these images and the words you have given them? One technique that I use regularly in my lessons, and again, I'll remind you, this is for simple things and also more complex things, is to deliberately mislead the student. Deliberately give the student the wrong word, the wrong answer. Because if you think about what would happen there, if you as whatever your native language is, I'm assuming most people taking this course are native English speakers. If somebody points at a picture of a police officer and says firefighter, straight away your brain's going to say, hang on, no, that's not a firefighter, that's a police officer. In the same way here, if your student has really understood these things, if we point at this picture of the melon and we say peach, and we point at the picture of the peach and we say melon, if your student has really understood this, their brain's going to tell them something is wrong, and they're going to say, no, this is a peach. When you point at this, they'll say melon. We can do it like this with our student. So here we are in the lesson again, and we're using screen sharing to show these images to our student. And we're going through and we've been using our cursor to highlight each of these words. And we've just been drilling our student, just going through them, getting the student to repeat the words. Maybe at first we said them, so we went through banana, apple, melon, orange, peach. And then we just pointed them out to our student. So what's this? And the student says banana. What's this? Apple. And here they say peach. And you just make a note of it. Okay. What's this? Orange. And then you point to this one. They say melon. And this happened a few times. So you decide to use this technique. So you take over and you say, okay, let's go through these again. Banana, apple, peach, orange, melon. If you go through like this and there's no reaction from the student, this gives you an idea that maybe they haven't really made the connection between these words and these images. But also at this stage, they may still be trying to figure it out. They may have realized that something is wrong, but they just need a little bit of time. So here we can use tone of voice to really stress to them that something isn't right. And these things may seem a bit silly at first when you start teaching, but you have to get used to this. You have to get used to using your facial expression and your tone of voice. I felt a bit silly when I started teaching doing this, but we can do it something like this. And again, you have to you have to get this right. So if you're teaching business English to somebody, you would have to adapt this style. Depends on the student and the environment, depends on the vocabulary, how you do this. But let's give this example. So banana, apple, peach, peach. And you're just trying to indicate to your student that something is not right. You have to be willing to exaggerate your expression a little bit. Peach, melon, melon. And at this stage, you want your student to be picking up. If they have made the connection, more often than not, and as the student gets used to your teaching style, they'll say, no, peach, melon, they'll get it right. If they don't, we can correct ourselves. We can say, okay, banana, apple, peach, melon. No, peach, melon, banana, apple, melon, orange, peach. And then hand control back to the student and go through again and see if they've picked up. But as we talked about before, don't push this too far. If you've already been through this a few times and your student is still making this mistake, we can decide at this point whether we need to come back to this later and not waste any more time at this point. The longer you spend on this, the more it eats into your lesson time. And you may end up rushing through later parts of the lesson, which can have a real detrimental effect. If this is a really serious thing, so maybe we're not talking about fruit here, maybe this is a grammatical structure, and your student is really struggling with this, we can make a note of it and possibly devote an entire lesson to this next time if this is something more serious. As a teacher, you always need to use your judgment in these cases. How far to push something? Is it really important? Or can we just come back to this in a few minutes and take the pressure off our students? If you remember when we were talking about eliciting, I said that eliciting isn't just something you do at one stage of the lesson. You should do it throughout your lesson. It's a very useful technique. It's a very useful technique that you can and should use throughout your lesson. And it's also applicable to simple topics, to simple vocabulary, and to more complex vocabulary. And it's no different with concept checking. It's a simple technique, but it can be used for basic things, basic grammar, basic vocabulary, but it can also be used for advanced vocabulary, advanced grammar. So I thought it important to give you an example of just using this, just to show you that it can be applied to a more advanced situation, something a bit more complicated than pictures of fruit. And in this situation, we're going to imagine that we've been teaching countable and uncountable nouns to our student. That's the topic of the lesson. And as you've been going through this, you noticed on a few occasions, you've heard your students say informations instead of information, because information is an uncountable noun. It's never plural. We never have a lot of informations. It's a little information, a lot of information. And you think they understand. You think, okay, I think they've got this, but we just want to make sure before we move on, because if they don't understand, it may affect an activity later in the lesson. So before I show you how I would do this, and remember, these are just my ideas. If you speak to 100 teachers, they might have a slightly different way of doing this. But just pause the video and think for a few seconds. How could you do this? So we don't have pictures now. We don't have images that we can point at with our cursor. These are sentences that we're dealing with now. And this student is a more advanced student. Their English is at a higher level. So what would you do to see if they understand that informations isn't correct? Well, I'd do it this way. I'd use the same technique, the misdirection technique, giving them the incorrect information and seeing if they can pick up on it. But what I would do here is I'd send them one sentence. Now this is just, you're teaching online, so it's very easy to send your students sentences. So I would send them one sentence that's incorrect. Then I would send them a correct sentence, a grammatically correct sentence. And then maybe another incorrect sentence. It doesn't have to be in this order. The first sentence can be the correct sentence, and then the next two can be incorrect. But what I want to do here is get the student to read these sentences and see if they can pick up on the fact that only one of these is correct. So again, remembering that this is a more advanced student, you can give more detailed instructions. And my goal here is to get the student to read the sentences, and specifically to read the incorrect sentences and see if they can pick up that these sentences are incorrect. And because this is a more advanced student, it's easier to give them instructions in this situation. So we can ask them, read the first sentence. Now we're going to cover this a little bit later, but remember, we should always keep our instructions simple. So don't say, okay, well, I'm going to ask you to read the sentences now. Could you read the 3 sentences and tell me which ones are right or wrong? That wouldn't be right. Simple instruction. Read the first sentence. And you want your student to read. So they will read, there are a lot of informations in the book. Okay, read the second sentence. And the student reads, there is a lot of information in the book. And read the third sentence. There is a lot of informations in the book. If they just read them and there's no reaction, you know that maybe they still haven't understood this. It could also be that they're not quite sure what you want them to do. So now we've read through once, I would ask them to read again. But this time we're going to help them in the same way that we did previously. We're going to use our tone of voice here to indicate that maybe a sentence isn't correct. Read the first sentence again. And they read, there are a lot of informations in the book. And here we will step in and say, informations. Is that okay? There are a lot of informations. Is that okay? And give your student a chance to think about this. And hopefully they will pick up and they will say, oh, no, it's not okay. And say, read the second sentence and let them read again. There is a lot of information in the book. And because this is the correct sentence, we can use a positive tone of voice. Like, yeah, there is a lot of information in the book. There is a lot of information in the book. Is that okay? And you can even do something like on the camera, on the webcam, show a thumbs up. Is that okay? And then we can go to the final sentence. Okay, read the third sentence again, please. There is a lot of informations in the book. We can do the same thing again. Informations? There is a lot of informations in the book. Is that okay? Is that okay? And show them. Use your face. Use your thumb. A thumbs up. Is it okay? Show them you're a bit confused. As you get used to teaching, as the student gets used to your teaching style, they will understand what you're doing at this stage. And most of the time, your student will pick up on what you are doing, and they will be able to eliminate the incorrect examples. But as we talked about before, it's really important to use your judgment. It's something that will come with practice, but there are several possibilities here. So if your student still doesn't get this at the end, we could decide that maybe right now this isn't so important and we can come back to it. We don't want to eat into our lesson time and have to rush through the rest of the lesson. It could be a case that we've made a mistake. Sometimes in a lesson, I realized that early in the lesson, I didn't do something that I should have done. So you can reflect after the lesson. Could I have done something differently? Was my explanation too complicated? And you can simplify things. The worst situation here is that you have overestimated your student's ability, and this is just something that's too difficult for them. And again, this will come with practice. It's a little bit difficult at the beginning because if you've entered a lesson and you've completely misjudged the level of your student, you're left struggling through the lesson. What will happen as you teach more and more, you will get a bank, a store of activities that you can use. So when you realize that, okay, maybe this lesson, maybe it's wrong. I thought this student's level was higher than it really is. So here you would need to stop and just move into a completely different activity. And that is something that just comes with experience as you teach more and more classes. So before we finish this video and before we move on from concept checking, let's just do a quick review. So why do we concept check? Well, we concept check in order to find out if the student fully understands the target language. As we discussed before, just asking them if they understand is not effective at all. We need to concept check to really find out. And it's okay if we find out that they don't understand. That's important information for us as a teacher. So we're not hoping always that the goal is that they understand. It's equally important to find out if they don't understand, as opposed to just the positive that, hooray, they understand and we can move on with the lesson. Because if we don't do this right now, if we don't get a clear picture of whether they understand or not, when it comes to activities that you have planned further in the lesson, the student's going to be stuck because we're building up, we're giving them this vocabulary for a reason. And if you want them to use this in an activity at the end of the lesson, it's going to be very difficult for them if they haven't fully understood. Go back to what we talked about. When we're teaching the student, we look at our lesson as a structure. We pull it apart into individual blocks, building blocks. And it's our job to give those blocks back to the student in a way that makes it easy for them to reassemble the structure at the end of the lesson. So if they haven't fully understood something, one of those blocks is going to be missing, and the lesson is going to be a struggle for both you and the student. Before we talk in a bit more detail about the next item in our toolbox, which is error correction, it's important to understand one thing, that mistakes, they're part of the process. They're part of any process where we are trying to get better at something, not just learning a language, learning the piano, learning jiu-jitsu. Anything where you're trying to improve has to involve mistakes. It's unavoidable. We need to embrace mistakes, embrace errors, instead of thinking about them as something negative. And then we need to pass that idea on to our student, because our student will make mistakes in the class. They'll make many mistakes. And I would actually say that if your student isn't making mistakes, something's wrong with the lesson. They should be making mistakes. If you are providing them with materials that are challenging for them, that are the right level then they should be making mistakes. If your student goes through the entire lesson, doesn't make any mistakes, then maybe the materials aren't appropriate for the student. So I don't necessarily think it's something to be celebrated if they don't make mistakes. The only way we can stop making mistakes is to stop learning. It's as simple as that. If you want to learn new things, we have to make mistakes. If we don't like mistakes, okay, stop learning. Just be happy with your skill level as it is. And think of it this way in the classroom. Every time your student makes a mistake, it exposes a gap in their knowledge and gives you an opportunity to fill in that gap, an opportunity to teach them. And therefore, it's an opportunity for them to learn something new, which is the goal, the point of what we are doing. And as with anything else, all the other tools we've talked about here, there's a correct way to do this. There's a wrong way, a very negative and destructive way to correct errors. And there's also a very positive and productive way to correct errors. With all that in mind, how should we use error correction in the classroom? Because we don't want our student to look and feel like this. This guy here on the right, he looks demoralized, fed up, like he's had enough of the class. So let's talk about what we shouldn't do first. So how not to correct. Don't just say no, wrong, incorrect, that's not right. We want to avoid this wherever possible. If we say no or wrong, well, first of all, there's no information there for your students. They have no idea what they did wrong. There's nothing to help them to correct themselves, which is the ultimate goal. We want our students to correct their own mistakes. These are also very negative words, and we want to create a positive atmosphere in our classroom. We talked about this before. Avoid giving the student the answer immediately. Sometimes you might do this by mistake. The student gives the wrong answer and you immediately give the right answer. Just take a second to think about why that's damaging for the student's learning. Why is this not a good thing to do? Because we want to be encouraging the student to figure things out for themselves. So in giving them the answer, we take that opportunity away from them. This next one here, this connects to what I think is the most important quality that any teacher should have. Not just an English language teacher, not just a language teacher, a taekwondo teacher, a chemistry teacher, a driving instructor. You must be patient. Without patience, you cannot be a successful teacher. We must never show frustration in the class. Now, I didn't say that you should never feel frustrated. There are many times in the classroom where I feel frustrated, but I never show this. I keep it to myself. If I show that I'm frustrated when my student makes mistakes, this is going to put my student under pressure. And if I put my student under pressure, they're likely to make even more mistakes. And if I'm already frustrated, this is going to create a very negative cycle in the class. So now let's talk about how to do this correctly. How can we correct mistakes effectively in the classroom? Now, what you're going to start to notice here as I go through this, and what you're hopefully going to notice, is that we don't use our tools in isolation. We don't just use concept checking by itself. We don't just use eliciting by itself. We use our tools together. So in order to correct errors, we need to elicit. We need to concept check. So one of the first techniques I will use as part of the process of correcting an error is just to write down the mistakes, write down the errors as they happen. Don't tell your student, do it discreetly, let them keep speaking. But if you hear a mistake, just write it down. As we did before, then we can send this sentence, send this error to our student. Maybe they said, yesterday I go to the cinema, and you know this should be yesterday I went to the cinema. You're pretty certain your students should know this. We can ask them to read it. Maybe they'll pick up on the mistake straight away. If they don't, we can read it and do what we talked about before when we talked about eliciting, concept checking, use our tone of voice, facial expressions to hint at the mistake. Yesterday I go to the cinema. We're trying to get this information from them. Just give them a clue that something's wrong. We did this before also. Send the student the correct sentence, but with some letters missing this time. So instead of sending the incorrect sentence, maybe they still haven't picked it up. So we say, okay, what about this sentence? Can you complete this sentence? And give them a chance to fill in the missing letters. So as you see, in order to correct mistakes effectively, we need to use our other tools. We need to elicit. We need to concept check. All of these things work together. We don't just take one tool out of our toolbox in isolation. We'll be using them together throughout the lesson. And here's a really important thing that we need to consider. Do we correct every mistake? Just think about that for a moment. As you're going through your lesson with your students and you're writing down their mistakes, do you think you should correct every mistake that they make? Well, here I would say a definitive no. If you're going to go through and correct every mistake that your student makes, you will just crush your student's spirit. You will demoralize them. And your lesson will just be a mess. You will eat into so much of your lesson time that you will never successfully complete any of your lesson plans. It's not important, and you should never aim to correct every student, to correct every error, every mistake that your student makes. So what should we be correcting? Well, I would say as a general rule, it's important to remember that there are always exceptions, but I would go for this. Focus on mistakes that are relevant to the target vocabulary of your lesson. To explain what I mean, let's imagine this is your notebook. So this is your desk, this is your notebook, and as the student is speaking, you have your lesson notes, and you're writing down the mistakes. You're doing it discreetly so your student doesn't see this. The goal of this lesson, you're teaching your student about the present perfect tense. So the grammatical structure, like I have been, I have seen, I have eaten, I have traveled to, she has done, she has finished, he has eaten. That's the present perfect tense. And you hear your students say, decided instead of decided. So you write this down. This was the first mistake that you wrote down. Then your student says, I have go to Paris many times. You make a note of this. Then they say, a little bit later, another mistake. They said, I think I will doing it again in the future. It's an understandable sentence, but it's a mistake, so you wrote it down. Then we had our old friend, informations, here instead of information. And you remembered this from a previous class, so you thought, wow, they're still making this same mistake. So I'm going to make a note of this. And then the last mistake that you wrote down was, he has tell me about it before. If we think that the goal of our lesson is to teach the present perfect tense, I have eaten spaghetti many times, she has traveled to Paris many times, which of these errors should we focus on, and which should we either leave to the end of the lesson if we have some spare time, or maybe move to another lesson? Just take a moment, take a minute to go through these. Which of these errors would you correct? So the first one, I wouldn't correct this. If the goal of my lesson and the goal of this exercise is the present perfect tense, mispronouncing this word here isn't important at the moment. The next one I would absolutely correct, because this is our target language. This is our target structure. So instead of saying, I have been to Paris, they have said, I have go. So it's important that we correct this. Important that we help them to correct this, because it's the target, the goal of our lesson. I think I will doing it again in the future. This is not relevant to what we're trying to teach the student right now. So again, I wouldn't cover this. As much as we want them to finally understand the difference between countable and uncountable nouns, right now at this moment, it's not important. I would possibly, because this is a mistake that we saw before from our student, I would possibly move this to the end of the lesson and maybe spend a couple of minutes if we have some time to cover it then. And the last one here, what do you think about the last one? I would correct this because, again, this is relevant. This is the target of the lesson, this grammatical structure. We know they should have said, he has told me about it before, and we want to give them a chance to correct this. So there you can see, out of all the mistakes that you wrote down, and please remember that in your lesson, you might have 20 mistakes that your student has made. But here, I'm just trying to simplify it. So from these mistakes that they made, I would only cover 2 of these because only 2 of these are important based on the lesson's goals. So we've made it to the last item in our toolbox. And here we're going to talk about giving instructions. Now, I'm sure you remember at the beginning of the course, I said that teaching is not giving instructions. And that's right. If you remember, I gave the example of the high school teachers that I had who would just come into the classroom, give us a page number and say exercise A, exercise B, you have 20 minutes. That's not teaching, that's giving instruction. But it's inevitable that if we're going to teach, we must give instructions. And like everything else we've talked about in our toolbox, there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. Or maybe it's more accurate to say there's an effective way to do this. So let's talk about it. We've clarified this. We're not here just to give instructions. Our job is far more complex than that, but giving instructions is part of that job, and we must get it right. We need to give instructions to our students to guide them through our lesson. It's very difficult to give a lesson if you don't tell your student what you want them to do. Also, we sometimes need to tell them what we don't want them to do. That's equally as important. But instructions are just a tool. It's a way that we can help our student to achieve their goals, and our goal of guiding the student successfully through our lesson. So I thought the best way to show you this is with a real life example. So here we have a worksheet. Now I'm going to use my cursor here to point a few things out to you. But first, before we talk about this anymore, I think we've seen this name already, One Stop English. I cannot recommend this enough. It's a paid subscription service, but you have access to fantastic lesson materials. I'm not sponsored, by the way. I'm not sponsored by One Stop English, but I found them to be the most useful with regards to professional materials. If you just take a look at this, this worksheet, it's ready to use in the classroom. I didn't have to create anything on this worksheet. This is a reading lesson. They provide reading lessons, listening lessons, conversation lessons. There are so many things that they have. And if you look at the way this is structured, and we're going to talk about the structure of our lessons in coming videos, but here at the beginning we have a warmer. This is an essential part of our lesson. The warmer gets the student relaxed and ready for the lesson. This warmer also presents the topic of the lesson, so it gets the student thinking about what the lesson is going to talk about, or what they're going to read about down here in this article. So here they have the warmer, and the warmer presents the topic. Here we've got the key words. So what is this? Why are we showing them or getting them to think about key words, key vocabulary? Yeah, this is pre-teaching. So we have an exercise here to pre-teach some important vocabulary. This is for an advanced student, so there's a lot of vocabulary here. You wouldn't always do 15 words. This is quite a lot. And I think I mentioned before, I would usually give something like this to the student in advance because this would take a very long time in the lesson. So I would usually send this exercise maybe in advance, maybe just before the lesson. But I would definitely give them a chance. You could just edit this worksheet, cut this section out, and send this to them the day before. But here, this is pre-teaching the important vocabulary. And here's a chance for them to practice using that vocabulary. Don't worry if you don't understand what these exercises are, but as we go through it, I'm repeating this for a reason. We have a warmer here to get the student relaxed. The warmer presents the topic of the lesson. They have a chance to learn the vocabulary in advance. So this is pre-teaching. There's a chance here to practice the vocabulary. In the article, they will read through and answer some questions, further practice with the vocabulary, further reading practice. I wouldn't do all these exercises. You will get used to picking and choosing which exercises you think you need to do. Usually it's a 60-minute lesson, so you don't have time to do everything. Sometimes I will just set certain exercises as homework. But down here, we have a discussion, or we have in your own words. So these are exercises that get the student to produce something. So if you think about, we talked about before with our teacher talk time, student talk time, at the beginning here, the student's going to be talking a little bit, but not a lot. You're going to be giving a lot of input. As we go through down here to the practice, the student's going to be talking a bit more. Reading, they're not going to be talking, they're going to be reading. But then when we get down here, after we've answered the questions, in the production stage, the student is going to be hopefully using some of this new vocabulary, using some new knowledge from the article, and producing something here in this discussion. And the teacher will be taking a step back and letting the student talk. So this is why these worksheets are fantastic, because they're already organized, ready for the classroom. As I said, in coming videos, we're going to talk a lot more about the stages of our lessons. So you'll hear those words again that I just talked about, the presentation, practice, production, and also the warmer. They are very important things. So let's go back. Let's get back to the topic at hand, which is giving instructions. I'm going to, again, just give you some simple examples. It's always important as a teacher, take the things that I tell you, make them your own, build on them. Don't just take them as me saying to you, this is the only way to do it. It's not. I'm just trying to give you an idea. You take these ideas, you make them your own. What I do when I'm giving instructions, I challenge myself to make it as simple as possible. So let's say we've gone through, maybe we've done the warmer, we've done the pre-teaching, and I want the student here I want to bring their focus here to exercise B on page 2. I would do it something like this. I would just say, actually, you know what? Before I tell you what I would do, I'll tell you what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't say, okay, let's go to page 2. Let's look at exercise B. I use some of the key words above to complete these sentences. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences with missing words. The missing words are all from this section here where we talked about the key words. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes. Take some time, look through this and complete it. Do you have any questions? Now, do you think that's a good way to give instructions? Even if I said that really slowly, do you think that's the right way to give instructions? Yeah, I would say a definitive no. It's way too much information. Even for a native speaker. I mean, I exaggerated obviously a little bit, but some teachers I have seen give instructions like that. You have to remember what we talked about before. This is a language learner. Every single word you say is another word that they have to deal with. They may already be feeling apprehensive looking at this exercise. They'll be thinking of the words they learned about in this, that you pre-taught them here. So we need to keep it as simple as possible. Don't fill up their head with extra unnecessary vocabulary. So if we're still here, maybe we've just finished this, I will say, okay, page 2, exercise B, use some, and I will stop there. And what I'm trying to do is get the student to continue reading. I don't need to say read. Trust me on this. When I was first shown this technique, I thought this isn't going to work. How's the student going to know? The student will know, and especially at the advanced level. Lower levels, they will still understand. And if they don't get it, I would just say it again. Page 2, exercise B, use some of, maybe give them a little bit more. And if you're screen sharing, they will also see your cursor here. And they will pick this up and they will read this sentence. Again, as a last resort, like we've done before, you can give them an extra bit of instruction. If you tried twice and they still haven't done it, okay, exercise B, read. Use some of the, and stop there. That's how you do it. The students over here somewhere, their focus, we just want to bring their focus down here to this sentence. And then what I would usually do is do the first one with them. Okay, number one, let's do it together. And you might notice I speak really slowly, but even with an advanced student, I will still speak slowly when giving instructions. When we're having a conversation, I might speak more quickly, but I just want to make sure the instructions are clear. So number one, let's do this together. I was something to see, and I stop there again and wait for the student to pick up the sentence. If they don't, I'll just read it again. Okay, number one, I was something to see, and they will eventually read this. We do the first question together, and then I might say, guide them into number two before I leave them alone to do the rest. Okay, number two, her efforts, and I stop. I'm trying to give them less information every time, make my instructions more brief, and hope that they can then pick up and just continue. And just like before, don't worry if the student doesn't pick this up straight away. You've got to be patient and you've got to have faith in your instructions. If you do this with confidence, the students will get it. So try again. Number two, her efforts, they will read this. After I've done the first two, then I would maybe say, okay, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I will give you 5 minutes. Go. Or I will give you 5 minutes. Start. Begin. You can choose whatever word you want. So we've given them very simple instruction. We help them with the first one. We push them to do the second one by themselves, and then we allowed them to continue with the exercise. And think about how many words we used. We used very few words. And that's what you should try to do throughout your lessons. You're just guiding your students around. Don't use more words than you need to. Welcome to the next stage of the course. And here we're going to talk about lesson planning. Our toolbox is ready. We have all the skills we need to deliver the lesson successfully, but those tools are useless unless we have a lesson plan ready. But before we talk about how we plan a lesson, let's think about this question. Can we teach without planning the lesson? That might sound like a silly question, but it's a real question. Think about it. Do you think you could successfully teach your student without planning your lesson? I would say no. You can try, and I've tried it in the past. Not very often, but I've tried it in the past. Maybe when I've been a bit lazy sometimes. I've tried it and it never works. It's always stressful and your lesson is a mess. Your lesson plan just gives you a framework. It allows you to step through the lesson professionally. If you just try to make the lesson up as you go along, it can look really unprofessional. And if you think about it, your student is your customer. And if you look unprofessional, this customer, this student, is unlikely to come back and book another lesson with you. Another thing you might not have thought about, apart from helping you to guide yourself and the student through the lesson with a lesson plan, your lesson plan actually makes it easy for you to see what works and doesn't work in your lesson. So imagine you plan a class and it doesn't go so well. If you have a lesson plan, afterwards you can sit down and go through your lesson plan. Try to pinpoint which stage of the lesson didn't work so well. And then you can use that to improve for the future. If you don't have a lesson plan, how do you know which part of the lesson was good, which part of the lesson wasn't good? So having a plan makes it better for you to also assess your own lessons. Let's talk about why we plan then. So we talked about, can we teach without planning? And the answer, I believe, is no. So why do we plan a lesson? What's the purpose in planning our lesson? Think of your lesson, however long it is, whether it's 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Sometimes you might have a 2-hour lesson. I have done that in the past. More often than not, it will be 60 minutes. But think of this lesson as a path. You're going from the start of the path to the end of the path. This is your lesson. If you don't know where the end of this path is, if you don't know what the goal of this lesson is, how can you plan the route? How do you know where to go? If we don't know what our goal is, we don't know how to get there. If you don't know where your destination is, how can you plan a route? The lesson plan provides the path that you guide your student along towards the language learning goal. And I would also say that this is true of any classroom environment. A teacher should always know the goal of their lesson. Otherwise, how do you know what are you doing in the class? If you don't know the purpose, how can you possibly plan the activities for your lesson? Now that we understand that every lesson needs to have a goal, a destination, and once we know that destination, or once we understand what our goal is, it's easier to plan the lesson so that we can guide our student towards that goal. And if we think about that goal as some kind of structure, our lesson plan allows us to pull that structure apart into the individual building blocks. And then as the lesson goes on, we give those building blocks step by step back to our student so they can reassemble the structure at the end of the lesson. And I find the best way to do this is to break the lesson down into stages. Now, you'll probably recognize some of the names of the stages here because we already touched on them earlier in the course. For 90% of your lessons, the 3 stages will be as follows: presentation, practice, production. PPP. Presentation, practice, production. Now, I say 90% of your lessons because there are always exceptions. Sometimes you might be helping to prepare a student for an exam, and in that case, the structure will be different. Some students just want conversation practice, and they will specifically tell you all they want to do is chat with you, have a conversation. So there are some exceptions, but 90% of the time, I recommend following this structure: presentation, practice, production. So what do we do in each of these stages of the lesson? So in the presentation, it's the first stage of your lesson, but not necessarily the beginning of your lesson, and we'll talk about why in a coming video. But in the presentation stage, we're introducing the topic of the lesson. We're introducing the target of our lesson to the student. Now, how you can do this will vary. You might show a short video to the students. You might read a short passage. You might act out some things, but you're just giving your student an idea of what you're going to be talking about in the lesson. In the practice stage, what we're doing now at this midpoint in the lesson is we're giving the student a chance to practice using this new language, using this new vocabulary. And if you remember about when we talked about teacher talk time and student talk time, so in the presentation, you're doing most of the talking because you're introducing something new. Here in the practice, it's like a 50-50. You're working with the student as they practice using this new language. It might be something very simple. Just to give you an example, if they're practicing a new structure, a new grammatical structure, maybe you give them some slips of paper. On each slip is a complete sentence, grammatically correct. And then you cut that sentence up, word by word, mix the words up, and they have to reassemble those sentences in the correct order. Something along those lines. It's a relaxed way of practicing the new structure. And then in the final stage of the lesson, and if we also remember about teacher talk time, student talk time, this is where you take a step back and you want the student now to produce something using the target language. And here it's not set in stone. It could be many things. The student could give a short presentation about something. You could ask the student, maybe they write a short story. Maybe two students here have a conversation with each other, but it's all now using the language that you introduced in the presentation stage. They practiced in the practice stage, and now they're putting it all together in the production stage. This is what I want you to focus on, especially at the beginning of your teaching career. As you get better and more relaxed with teaching, it's not always going to be as rigid as this. But this is a really good way to think about your lessons. And if you think about it in this way, planning the lesson also becomes a lot more simple, because we as a teacher now have a very clear framework within which to plan our lesson. If you remember in the last video, I said that the presentation stage is the first part of your lesson, but not necessarily the beginning. So maybe that sounded a bit confusing. Now thinking about it now, it does sound a bit ridiculous. But here I want to explain what I mean. The presentation stage is the first part of your lesson plan, but not the first part of your lesson. The first part of your lesson should be a warmer. Your student might come to the class. They may have been at work all day. They might be tired, stressed. They might be nervous. And what we need to do is help them to relax into the lesson. The warmer helps the student to relax and gets them thinking in English or thinking in the target language. Maybe you're going to be teaching Spanish. The same techniques apply. It just gives them time to relax, and it gives their brain time to adjust to the new language environment. Imagine if you're an English speaker, you've been speaking English all day long, and suddenly you're in an Italian lesson. You need a bit of time for your brain to adjust. So let's talk about what a warmer should look like. What do we do as a warm-up activity? Well, I'll give you some ideas, and these are just my ideas. It's important as a teacher that you develop your own style. Things that work for me might not work for you. I've taken a lot of things from other teachers, a lot of ideas. Sometimes they've worked for me, sometimes they haven't worked for me. Some ideas I just needed to adapt a little bit to make them work for myself. So I'm not suggesting that you must do these things, but it's just to show you what kind of activities warmers can be. The first one, I've done this quite a lot in my class. Just ask the student to tell you 3 things that they did yesterday. That's it, really simple. If your student's more advanced, you can put some restrictions on this. So tell them they can't tell you obvious things like they had breakfast or they went to bed. They have to tell you something in a bit more detail. If your student is of a lower level, then yes, you can accept the most obvious things. If you're doing this for the first time, you can do this first. Give them an example. You tell them 3 things you did yesterday. Maybe type it out as you're speaking. This is something else that I've done quite a lot. You might be reluctant to try things like this at the beginning because I remember I was always worried that they wouldn't work. But if you introduce them with confidence, if you give instructions with confidence, your students will do these. It might take them a little bit of time just to get going, for them to click exactly what you want. But 10 things you can do with a tomato. Give them the first examples. And again, we can vary this. If your student is of a lower level, let them choose the most obvious things. We can eat it. We can chop it. We can buy it. If your student has a higher level of English, if their ability is much better, tell them they can't say the most obvious things. You can't say cook, you can't say buy, you can't say eat, just to challenge them. Another activity that's worked really well for me, this one kind of depends on your student's personality. I found students who are a bit more outgoing, this is a really good activity. Word association, you start off with them just in the chat. Send them a word like shoe and just say, what do you think about when you read the word shoe? If they're not quite sure what you mean, give them a really obvious example. Send them water, then drink. Send them the word drink, then glass. Glass, then smash. Something like that, just to get them started. And you can go through word association with your student. This is something that I established with a lot of my regular students. So the first three are things maybe I would do with new students, the first few lessons. But once we've had a few classes together, I always like to review previous lessons. It helps reinforce that vocabulary, and doing this is also a good warmer. Ask the student to choose a few words, just 2 or 3 words or expressions from the previous lesson. Tell them that they are now the teacher and they can teach these words to you. Let them explain the words to you, give you example sentences. I don't mean to keep repeating myself, but you have to be aware of your student's level. A beginner student might struggle with this activity. So this will be for students who've been having lessons with you regularly. And once they get used to this, it's a fantastic way to start every lesson. Another alternative, just a quick conversation. Something really simple. How are you? How are you feeling? How was your day? Just something, just chit chat the same way you would with a colleague at work. Just have a conversation with them, ask them about their day, ask them some follow-up questions. All of these activities, all of these warmers, they're simple. Thinking back to when we talked about giving instructions, if you can't explain these simply to your student, don't do them. They must be easy to explain and they must be easy to do. These aren't to test your student's ability. They're just warmers to get your student to relax. And it really doesn't matter in the warmer here when you give them 10 things you can do with a tomato. If they only write 4 things, it does not matter. This is not a test. It's getting them relaxed. If you take this too seriously, then it's not a warmer. If it makes your student feel more stressed, then it's not a warmer. Also, they should be easy to explain, easy to do, and shouldn't take a lot of time. 5 to 10 minutes maximum, I would say, out of a 60-minute lesson. If the warmer's taking 15 minutes, 20 minutes, then it's not appropriate. It needs to be quick and easy to do. This is also something really important. The warmer does not have to be connected to the lesson goal. So the reason I separated this and said that the presentation is the first part of your lesson plan. Here the warmer, we're doing this before we start the lesson plan. It's not connected at all. It's a separate activity. It's like stretching before you go for a run. You stretch before you start your exercise. And here we help the student to warm up and relax before we start going through the lesson plan with them. And that's it. That's the main goal here. The goal is just to get the student relaxed and thinking in English or the target language. Nothing more complicated than that. Before we can even start planning our lesson, we need to understand what are we doing in the lesson. Now, if we're using any kind of materials, if we're using a worksheet, can we plan our lesson before we've even checked the worksheet? Well, no, of course we can't. We need to check through the worksheet, to look what's included, to check the structure, the flow of the worksheet, so that we can then use that to plan our lesson. These worksheets, especially the ones I'm using here from One Stop English, they're made by experienced teachers. So they will be structured in a way that gives your lesson the presentation, practice, production flow that we've been talking about. They may also even include a warmer. They will also have things like a section on pre-teaching included. So as you go through this worksheet, not only will you understand more clearly what you're going to be using in the class, but it will also give you ideas how you can plan your lesson, because the worksheet will already be structured. Well, if it's a good worksheet, it will already be structured. Let's check through this. Let's do this together. I'll try to give you an idea of my thought process as I'm looking at the new material. The first thing I would check if I've downloaded a worksheet, I will look if there are any teacher's notes. So here we have a 5-page worksheet. The teacher's notes are usually on the first page or the first couple of pages. And the reason that you should check these is because they're here to help you. They are here to help the teacher. Here we have, it tells you the skills that we're focusing on. So this is for reading and speaking practice. Here, this is really important. This tells you the focus, the grammatical focus of this lesson is the third conditional. That's really important. So now we have a clear goal for our lesson. It's to teach the student how to use the third conditional. If you're not sure about what the third conditional is at the moment, that doesn't matter. If your understanding of English grammar isn't amazing at the moment, as you start to teach, it will become much better because you'll have to learn these things in order to teach the student. It's one of the most effective ways to learn something, to teach it to somebody else. But if you're not sure, here's the third conditional here. If I had set my alarm, so if plus past perfect, if I had, if she had, if we had, I would have been on time. So if I had set my alarm, I would have been on time. If plus the past perfect, and then would, could, might, have, plus the past participle. Would have been, could have done, might have seen. But it doesn't matter if you're not 100% sure of that right now. But we know that this is the focus of our lesson. So even if you don't really understand this, you have time before the lesson to study it. But we now know our focus for this lesson is the third conditional. It also tells us a level here for the student. So this is aimed at upper intermediate students, teenagers and adults. And you're looking at around 60 minutes for this lesson. So this is why I said you don't always have to cover everything on the worksheet. This is 60 minutes plus. Most of my online lessons are 60 minutes, so you have to make sure that you allow enough time. So I won't always do everything that's on the worksheet. Anything that I leave, I will just set for homework. So now we have a much clearer idea of what our focus is. So before we even started planning the lesson, we know that our goal is for the student to be using the third conditional. And look here, we even have, they give you an idea for a warmer. Now, you don't have to follow their idea, but at the beginning, this might help you. It just gives you an idea. Maybe you can take this idea and change it a little bit. This is what I was saying. These worksheets are made by experienced teachers. So they're designed with a structure. So we have a warmer, and then here, it tells you the procedure. It pretty much guides you through what the teacher should be doing at each stage of the lesson. Now, I don't always follow this. I make my own plan. But at the beginning, why not? You could just go through and follow this step by step. It will help you. And as you get more experienced as a teacher, you can start, instead of following this procedure that they give you, you will get an idea of what works, what doesn't work, and you can start to plan your own lessons. So after doing this now that I have an idea of the structure of the lesson, what my goal is going to be for the student to be using the third conditional at the end of the class. That's going to be the production stage. I have this clear in my mind. In the production stage of the lesson, I want the student to be producing something using the third conditional. And now I just have to figure out how to get there. So what I would do next is I would just check through the worksheet. I would look at every section and see what's included. So first we see here, so this is on page 3. So this is the section that you will send to your student. Sorry for jumping backwards and forwards, but page 1 and 2, you don't send to the student. On page 3 here, we have a reading. So I would read this before the lesson. I would go through it so that I understand what the student's going to be reading. If you don't read it and they ask you a question about something in here, it could be a bit embarrassing because you won't be able to answer their question. So read this, get familiar with it, understand what's in here. Okay, so we have this reading here and we have an image here. So I think this is great. This image really gets your attention. So I already know that I could use this image for something. I could use this for eliciting. I could elicit from the student what this woman's feeling. Why is she feeling this way? But I'll go into more detail. So I'm just getting some ideas now. Later, I'll figure out How am I going to pad this out a bit? But we have a reading and a great image that we can use. Then on the next page, on page 4, we have some vocabulary exercise. Okay, so we have some words here. So what is this? What's the purpose of this exercise? This is pre-teaching. The person who designed this worksheet has decided that maybe this vocabulary might be a bit tricky. It might be new for the student. So we're just going to pre-teach these so that when the student reads this, they're not going to get stuck on these words. We're always preparing the student. Remember the idea of giving them the building blocks that they need to be able to complete these exercises. So we pre-teach, and then when they read, they should have less problems. Okay, then after the pre-teaching, we have the reading here. So they're going to go into the reading, and they have some true or false questions to answer. So we're just getting a much clearer idea of what we're going to be doing in the lesson. So here we need to use the skills that we learned about with giving instructions to get the student to read, go through this, and then decide whether these statements are true or false. What I would probably do already, I'm thinking I would maybe do the first one with them. I would direct them to read just the first paragraph and do this with them. Is this true or false? So let's do this together here. Let's decide. I'd been looking for a new job for a while as I really hated my present one. Let's look at this. So Emma liked her present job. Well, no. So we know that this is false. So I would help the student to go through this, just the first one. If they seem to be struggling, maybe I would do the first 2, and then I would let them go through the rest on their own. So we know the structure now. So I'm going to use this image for some kind of eliciting, so probably the presentation stage. I'm going to use eliciting and this image. We have some pre-teaching, and here the reading, we have a practice section. What do they do here? Number 3, make sentences in the third condition. Okay, yeah, so this is the practice. So they're going to read, get this information, whether it's true or false, and then they're going to use the information that they get here and change it into the third conditional. Let's have a look here. So they give an example. If she had set her alarm, she would have been on time. So where is this in the article? Okay, here we go. On the day of the interview, I overslept. I must have forgotten to set my alarm the night before. Oh, and this also we have here. So they've given one example using the target structure. If only I had set my alarm, I would have been on time. So then we'll go through with the student here. We'll take the information that they've got and they change it into the third conditional. So this is the practice. We're going to elicit from this picture in the presentation stage. Some pre-teaching. They have the reading and a chance to practice using the target language. And then underneath here, they have a speaking. So this is going to be our production stage. They have an idea. They give you an idea here of what you could do. In groups, talk about the following: a bad day that you had in the past. Okay, so you're going to, if you were in a classroom setting, put the students in pairs and get them to talk to each other using the third conditional about a bad day they had. Or they could tell each other about a bad day and then their partner has to change that into the third conditional. We're in usually a one-on-one setting, so you could be the student's partner. You tell the student about a bad day you had, and they tell you about a bad day they had. Something like that will work together. But there we go. So by looking through this worksheet, we understand the purpose of our lesson. We understand that this is for the student to understand and use the third conditional. We also now understand how to use our worksheet. We haven't got the details yet, but I know I'm going to use this image. I'm going to elicit some vocabulary from the students using this image for the presentation stage. We have some pre-teaching. Then we have a chance for the students to practice using the target vocabulary, the target grammatical structure. And then here we have a production stage at the end of the worksheet. And just like that, with no more than 5 minutes, 10 minutes of checking your material, you already have a much clearer idea of how to start planning your lesson. Before we go further and start to plan our lesson, I just wanted to take some time to talk about time management. Now, this is obviously an important part of our lesson because if we get everything else right, but we don't manage the time in the lesson correctly, we're going to end up either finishing the lesson too early and potentially having an uncomfortable time at the end of the lesson when we have nothing left to do, or we could end up not leaving enough time and rushing through the lesson at the end, which also isn't good for the student if we're rushing them through the lesson. But even though this is really important to manage our time correctly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. And first of all, I just want to show you why and show you how I used to manage the time in my lessons. So here we have a lesson plan, and I used to write my lesson plans like this. If you see at the end here, we have 5 minutes. So I've allocated 5 minutes for this part of the lesson. And then the next part here, I've said 10 minutes. And then here we've got 5 minutes, then 5 minutes again, 5 minutes again. And on the final part of the plan, we've got 5 minutes again here, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. You get the idea. And just think about this, especially if you're new to teaching. You're thinking about so many things already in the lesson because early on in your career, these things aren't automatic for you. So there's just so much that you're trying to think about at the same time. And also, if you're teaching online, you might be getting used to the new environment. You may never have worked in this way before, sharing information, screen sharing with the student. That also takes time to get used to. And then here, you're looking on your lesson plan and you're thinking, okay, I've got 5 minutes here for this section, right? I better do in 5 minutes. Then I've got 10 minutes for the next section, then 10 minutes. How do you think that's going to feel for you in the lesson with this additional now factor that you're thinking about all the time? Well, I would suggest that it's not a good idea. I'm not going to say don't do it, it's up to you. If you want to do it like this, if it makes you feel more comfortable, then by all means go ahead. But what I would suggest is just think about it this way. Use your common sense. We don't really have to break it down into that much detail. If we're following the presentation, practice, production lesson plan, we're breaking our lesson down that way, then we've got really 3 stages of our lesson, 3 main stages. And if your lesson's 60 minutes, well, it doesn't take a genius to work out you need roughly 20 minutes for each stage of your lesson. I say roughly because maybe one section will take 15 minutes, another section might take 25 minutes, but we really don't need to break it down that much. It's roughly 20 minutes for each section. And all you've got to do is just keep an eye on the time. As you're going through each section, just keep monitoring the time. You'll know that if you're 40 minutes into the lesson and you're still on the practice stage, you're going too slowly. If you're only 20 minutes into the lesson and you've already started the production stage, then you're going way too fast. That's all you need to think about. Just manage the time using your common sense. And the same here, if you have a slightly different lesson plan, maybe you've decided to add an extra section to a particular lesson, then it's just 15 minutes for each section. Just break it down that way. Don't get bogged down into what I used to do. I'm going to do 4 minutes for this part of the lesson, then 7 minutes for this part of the lesson. Just use your common sense, keep an eye on the time, and just break it down into the main sections of the lesson. So now that we've talked a little bit about time management, let's get back to planning our lesson and let's think about the presentation stage. In the previous video, we took a look at our material. We decided to check through the worksheet that we're going to use to see what was included and to get a rough skeleton of a lesson plan in our minds to see how we're going to break this worksheet down to get the presentation, practice, production sections that we need for our lesson. And in fact, let's just go back and take another quick look at that worksheet. Here we have the same worksheet. So we checked the teacher's notes. We saw here that we're focused on reading and speaking. So those are the skills. The grammatical focus here for our lesson is the 3rd conditional. And this is for upper intermediate students. So we already know that our student is this level. So this is appropriate. We then took a look through at what's actually on the section that we're going to give to the student, we saw we have this short reading here for the student and this really good image, a very good image, very evocative, great for eliciting vocabulary. That's going to be our presentation part of the lesson. Here we had some pre-teaching. We're going to teach a little bit of vocabulary in advance. And then we decided that this would be our practice section. So the students will read through some true or false statements, and then they turn those sentences into the target grammar, so into the third conditional. So this is our practice. And then the speaking section, this is going to be our production. We haven't decided exactly what we're going to do here, but the student is going to produce something. Maybe they will work by themselves and tell us about a bad day they had, or maybe the teacher could work with the student and we could interview each other. We then take the information we get from that interview and then present it using the third conditional. But we can decide. So first, let's focus on the presentation stage. And before we get into the details of what we're going to do, it's always important to think about why we do the things that we do. You can have some success if you just do what you're told, but if you understand why you're doing what you're doing, it's going to make you better at whatever it is you're trying to do. So why do we need this presentation stage? Why don't we just go straight into the worksheet without bothering? Let's just forget the presentation and, let's get into the lesson. Well, again, here we have to think about this from our student's point of view. Our student might have been at work all day. They might have been at university studying something completely different. And when they come to our lesson, their mind might be wandering. They might be thinking about what they need to do tomorrow. The presentation stage, it brings their focus into our lesson. It gets them thinking about the topic of the lesson. If your lesson is going to be about teaching them vocabulary to deal with going to a restaurant, you want to get them thinking about what it's like to be in a restaurant. If you're going to be talking about travel, going through an airport, dealing with customs, you want to get them thinking about being in an airport. It also introduces the target language. This is the first time that the student, or hopefully the first time that they're going to see the new target language, the new vocabulary, the new grammatical structures. And this is how learning works. The first time you see something, you don't remember it, you forget it. So we introduce it, then you see it again later, or you hear it again later, and then over time, slowly, this is reinforced in your memory through repeated exposure and repeated use. So here, we just introduce the target language. We bring the student's focus into the topic of the lesson, and we introduce the target language to them. They start to become familiar with the new language. It also, at this point, gives you a chance, gives the teacher a chance, just to assess how much the student already knows about either this topic or this target language. You may find that your student knows a lot more about this than you initially thought they would. They may already be a little bit familiar with the new target language. And we're going to talk about this a bit later, and this is where it's always good to have a plan B. So if you come to this section and you're presenting the target language, the topic of the lesson, and they know a lot about it, maybe they can already use and produce the target language. And it's at this point you'd need to go to a plan B. But that's for a future video. And we talked about the warmer before, this separate section that we can have right at the beginning of our class that doesn't have to be connected to the topic of the lesson. Well, remember I said it's optional. You don't have to do a warmer. It's up to you. I think it's a good idea. But you could also use the presentation stage as a warmer. If you have a lot to cover in your lesson and you don't want to have this separate section that might eat into 10 minutes of your lesson time, you could just say, okay, the presentation stage is going to be my warmer. This is how I'll get the student relaxed, thinking in English, and at the same time, I'll get them thinking about the topic, and I'll also introduce the target language to them. This is something that you can do. There is no hard and fast rule. You can have a separate warmer, or you could incorporate the warmer into your presentation stage. totally up to you. So now that we understand why we have this stage, why we bother with this presentation stage, let's go to the next video and let's start to think a bit more in detail about exactly what we are going to do in the presentation stage. So now we have a clear understanding of why we need this presentation stage in our lesson. Let's finally get down to business. Let's get down to planning this out. So let's think about the procedure that we're going to go through in this section. And what I'm going to do here is really go into some detail because I just want to make the thought process clear for you. When you actually make your lesson plan, the piece of paper that's going to be on your desk as you go through the lesson, that doesn't need to be very detailed. It should just be as close to bullet points as you can get it, so it's easy to follow during the lesson. But right here, let's just get into some detail and think about how we can correctly guide our student through the presentation stage. Now, if you remember, we're going to use this image. Let's see if we can quickly check that. So yeah, let's go back here. So we've got this image and we need to direct the student's attention to this image. So that's the first thing we need to think about. So this would be the first thing that I would go through. Let's just read this and then we'll break it down. So ask your student questions about the picture. Tell them that this was yesterday so they understand that it's in the past. Thinking about this now, we can use eliciting for this. Why are we telling them? That's my mistake here. I shouldn't have wrote tell them, but I'm going to leave that in there because it gets me to think about this. Why should I tell them? Let's elicit. Ask your student, do you think this picture was taken today or in the past? Was this yesterday or last week? And see if you can get your student to tell you, no, this picture was in the past. And now the student is thinking about the past. They're going to be automatically using the past tense when they speak. And now we can direct them back to the picture. So what do you see in the picture? And I'm pretty sure they're going to tell you a woman, and you can now ask them, what's she doing? What do you think this woman is doing? All the time we're getting them to give us the information. And they're going to say something like she's screaming, she's shouting, something like this. Then you can ask them, remembering that this is in the past, how did she feel when this picture was taken? Do you think she was happy? We can use concept checking. If they struggle and they're not sure what to say, do you think she felt happy when this picture was taken? And I'm almost certain that they'll say no. And then ask them, okay, how did she feel? And get some vocabulary from them. They might give you a few words here. Okay, she felt angry. Do you think there's any other? Did she feel anything else? And get some vocabulary from your student. You could even tell them specifically, tell me 5 things that you think she felt. So she felt angry, and try to get something else from them. And then once we have these emotions from the student, then ask your student to give reasons why she felt that way. And here we're going to correctly give instruction. Okay, 5 minutes. Why did she feel angry? Or why did she feel tired? Really simple instruction. I could even show my hand on the webcam. Okay, 5 minutes. Why did she feel angry? Think of as many reasons as you can. Go. Something simple like that. Again, you can use your own words here. And once again, if they're struggling, we could do the first one with them. I could give them an example. Okay, I think she felt angry because, and just get them started with one example. And then we leave the student to work. When the student comes back, after they've completed this task, now we need to get the feedback from the student. And as we get the feedback, we're going to try to structure it for them, guiding them along here. We want to put this in the right framework. So we could even write something like this. Remember, you're screen sharing with them. So you could give them an example beginning for a sentence. She felt angry because. Okay, tell me, why did she feel angry? If they don't use this structure, just repeat it again. Give them their answer back. If they say, because she had a fight with somebody. Oh, so she felt angry because she had a fight with somebody. Eventually, they'll pick up that you want them to use this specific structure. And as they give you this feedback, we're also going to type this on the screen. And I'll show you how to organize this in the next video. So now we've got our feedback from the student. And we're now going to introduce the target language, the third conditional. So we're going to change the student sentences into the third conditional to show them the structure. And just as an example here, they might say, she felt angry because she lost her bank card. And we're going to change that for the student. We're going to do this for them because at this point, they don't know this grammatical structure. So we change it to, if she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt angry. And we're going to do that for every sentence that the student gives us. And we could even go further and maybe ask our student what each of the sentences has in common. We can underline the structure for them, underline the key parts of the sentence. Just like we have here, if she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt. And if we underline this in every sentence, it will start to become clear to the student. The structure will not be, they won't fully understand it, but they'll start to see that there is a common structure in all of these sentences. And again, it really doesn't matter at this point if they're still a bit confused. The practice stage will help them to reinforce this and to get more familiar with it. So now we have this idea of how we're going to break this down. But it's really important that we display this information really clearly for the student as we're going through. If you're in a classroom, you'd be doing this on the whiteboard or the blackboard. We're going to use screen sharing for this so the student can see your screen. So whatever you type on your screen, they'll be able to see it. And a good way to think about how we should do this. Imagine at the end of the lesson, somebody comes into your office or your classroom. This is also relevant to a classroom. And they look at the whiteboard or the blackboard, or they look at your computer screen. If they look at your lesson notes, what you showed to the student during the lesson, could they clearly understand what you were trying to explain to the student? If they can, that means you displayed the information correctly. If your whiteboard after the class or your computer screen, if your notes look like a chaotic mess, then that's what it would also look like to the students. So we need to present these things as clearly as possible to the student. And we'll talk about how to do that in the next video. And we finished up in the last video with the procedure of the presentation stage clear in our minds. We have a good idea of how we're going to go through this. To simplify it, we're going to elicit some vocabulary from the student using the image. And then with the feedback from the student, we're then going to introduce the third conditional by changing the student's sentences into the third conditional. But we need to display this information as we're going through. We need to show the student what we're doing. Make it as clear as possible for them so they can follow along. And as I said before, if you were in a classroom, you'd do this on the whiteboard or the blackboard. Here in an online setting, we can use screen sharing and our screen becomes the whiteboard or the blackboard. And one thing I was told at the beginning of my career is that if you're going to present information to the student on the whiteboard, or in this case, the computer screen, you need to plan how you're going to do it. How are you going to use the space to display this information clearly to the student? Remember, if it looks like a chaotic mess to you, then it's also a chaotic mess to the student. If it's clear and easy to follow for you, then it's clear and easy to follow for the student. If somebody can look at your screen and easily understand what you're trying to explain to the student, then you're doing it correctly. So the first thing we said we were going to do is we were going to ask the student how the woman felt. We're trying to get some emotions from them. So the first thing I would do is, as the student is giving you this feedback, we just type it out. That's it, nothing more complicated. Don't get 10 or 20 words from the student. Just limit this to 4 or 5 words. We don't need any more. And this is it. This is how you display it. Maybe get the students to quickly read through it after you've written the list. Get angry, scared, tired, annoyed, frustrated. And at this point, if there are any serious pronunciation errors, maybe you have some time to correct those. It's up to you to decide if that's relevant to the lesson. And then next, we said that we were going to ask the student why this woman felt these emotions. What made her feel angry, scared, tired, annoyed, or frustrated? Well, let's just write the question out here. Whatever emotion we decide to focus on, let's just write the question on the screen. You could even get the student to choose one of these emotions and just focus on it. And here we can ask them the question and they can see the question as we are saying it. Okay, so why did she feel angry? We can give our instruction, okay, 5 minutes. Why did she feel tired? Think of 5 reasons. Think of as many reasons as you can. Go. And that's it. That's all we need to do to get them started. Remember, if they get stuck, you could do a first example for them. And next, we're getting the feedback from the student. And I said we need to try to structure it for the student. So as they give you the feedback, let's write this out also. It's okay to ask your student just to stop for a second while you write something out if you're not an amazing typer. And that's it. We display this clearly on the screen for the student to see it. And again, we can ask the student to read through this. Okay, just read sentence 1. She felt angry, and then get the student to finish. Read the next sentence. Read the next sentence. And do you see here already, we have a clear structure that the student can follow. If somebody looks at this, they can see what we're doing. So we got our feedback, and now we said next we're going to introduce the target language to the student. So I would read this. I would say, okay, so she felt angry because she lost her bank card. What if she hadn't lost her bank card? If she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt angry. She felt angry because she lost her bank card. If she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt angry. And you see, as I'm reading that, I'm just trying to highlight those key parts of the structure, the hadn't lost and wouldn't have. I'm just stressing these. I've also underlined them so the student can see that these 2 parts of the sentence are important. Do the same with the next one. And here, because we have forgot in the original sentence and remembered, you know what I would do here? I'd try to elicit this. She felt annoyed because she forgot her keys and couldn't go home. Forgot. Forget. What's the opposite of forget? Hot, cold, black, white, tall, short. Forget, remember. If she had remembered her keys, she could have gone straight home. If she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt angry. If she had remembered her keys, she could have gone straight home. Just a quick point here. I'm really going over this slowly because I just want you to understand what I'm thinking about, what I'm going to do in the lesson. You've got to be careful with going over things too much in the lesson. It could get a bit boring for the student, so I wouldn't necessarily stress this as much as I'm doing here. I just want to exaggerate it a bit just so you can see what I think about when I'm imagining how I'm going to do this with my student. And we got the same for the last sentence. She felt frustrated because she had argued with her friend. If she hadn't argued with her friend, she might have been happy. Hadn't argued, had remembered, hadn't lost. And it's here where you could ask your student, just highlight this here, like I'm doing. What does every sentence have? What does every sentence have? Hadn't lost, had remembered. And pause there, see if your student's going to read this. Just see if they can pick up that there is a connection, a common structure to all these sentences. If they don't get it fully right now, doesn't matter. We're going to cover this again in the practice. Another chance for them to solidify this, to get used to using it. But just take a look at that. Imagine this is on the screen for the student. Do you think that's clear and easy to follow? If they screenshotted the lesson, could they use this for themselves afterwards? Remember, the left side, they're never going to see this. This is our thinking. These are our notes. But on the right side, that's what they're going to see. Do you think that's clear and easy to understand? Yeah, I think so. So we need to make sure that when we give the student information on the screen here, on our whiteboard, on our blackboard, it's really easy for them to follow. But the next thing we need to do is take this information that's on the left. This is not good for a lesson plan. This is just so we could break it down in our minds and decide what we're going to do. If you write this much detail on your lesson plan, especially because this is just one stage of our lesson, your lesson plan is going to become like a short story. It will be very difficult to follow this if you get stuck in the lesson and you need to look at your notes. Oh, what am I doing next? So now we need to condense this into something that's useful for us in the lesson. So here's our actual lesson plan. So lesson plan for a very bad day. Optional warmer, it's up to you. I've included it just to remind us that the warmer is there. 3 things that you did yesterday. And then let's go back. We're going to take all of this on the left and let's just summarize it. Number 2, presentation. Use the picture on the worksheet to elicit how the woman felt. That's what we did. Then ask the student, why did she feel, and whatever emotion you decide to focus on. We get our feedback from the student and then change the sentences into the 3rd conditional to introduce the structure, the target structure to the student. If she hadn't lost her bank card, she wouldn't have felt angry. So these are just our notes to remind ourselves what we're doing. Look at the difference between this initial planning and what we eventually end up with. Your lesson plan, the piece of paper you're going to look at during your lesson, should be as brief as possible. It's just there to jog your memory. And now we have the presentation stage planned. Let's move forward and take a look at the practice stage. You're going to have to get used to repetition in this course because repetition is essential when you're learning something new. If you want to learn new vocabulary, you have to repeatedly see that vocabulary. Repeated exposure. If you want to learn to play the violin, you have to repeatedly do the same things over and over again. Practice those same skills over and over again. There's no quick way to do it. So there's a reason why I'm going to repeat a lot of the same things to you at different stages. So now we're talking about the practice stage. We're going to talk about how we're going to do this. How are we going to guide the student through this stage? And before we can plan the practice stage of the lesson, we need to understand the goal of the production stage. I've said this a lot. We cannot get to our destination. We cannot plan our route to our destination if we don't know what the destination is. We start off with a general idea of what we want at the end of our lesson so that we can plan from the beginning of the lesson and guide the student to that point. But it's the same at each individual stage. We need to remind ourselves We can't plan the presentation stage correctly if we don't know what we want to do in the practice stage. We can't plan the practice stage correctly if we don't know what we're going to do in the production stage. It's really important to remind yourself of this all the time. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's the purpose? If we don't know where we're going, we can't decide how to get there. So before we actually go into the procedure for the practice stage, let's just remind ourselves what we are planning to do at the end of the lesson, because we're near the end of the lesson plan. The next stage is the production. So here is the production stage. So we're not thinking about writing or reading. Here, it's going to be speaking. And we decided that we were going to have the student talk about a bad day that they had using the third conditional. And if we're going to get them to talk about a bad day, it's a good idea to get them to talk about somebody else's bad day first, to read about somebody else's bad day, and how we can then imagine what would have happened if events had been different. And that's what we're going to do here in this section. Give them a chance to read through this article about this lady's bad day. First, we're just going to get the information back, but then we're going to imagine what would have happened. If she had set her alarm, she would have been on time. So that when they come to talk about their own bad day, they already have an idea. They have the situation, the scenario in their minds. So now, let's take a look in a bit more detail about how we're going to organize the procedure for the practice stage of the lesson. And what I've done here, just to make it a bit easier, instead of going backwards and forwards to the worksheet, I've just put the worksheet here on the right of the screen so we can see it as we're going through the practice stage. And remember, again, as we're going through the procedure of the practice stage, we're going to really break it down into a lot of detail. This is just for our benefit, so we get the stages clear in our head. And remember, when we put it on the lesson plan, we're going to really condense it into as brief a description as possible. It's just to jog our memory. So what we'll do here, we'll just go through the procedure. I'm not going to go into any detail here about how we're going to do this. First, let's just talk about what we need to do. And then in the next video, we'll decide how we're going to display this to the student, exactly how we're going to guide the student through it. But let's just decide what to do first. So we got our worksheet. Now, if we want the student to read something, what do we need to check first? Are they going to know all the vocabulary? No. So the first thing we need to do here is this section at the top. So what's the name for this? This is this is the pre-teaching. So number one, we're going to pre-teach the vocabulary in exercise 1. And because there are only 4 words here, this is a really short pre-teaching, and it's with an upper intermediate student. I wouldn't do this in advance. If it was 10 words, I would send it the day before to the student. Here though, let's just go through it with them. And we're going to keep it as simple as possible, not spend a lot of time on this. Really, with an upper intermediate student, this should be fairly straightforward. Then we're going to direct the student to the reading exercise. So we're going to bring them down here to exercise 2. We're going to do A with them. So we're going to work with the student here, possibly A and B, depending on how the student's doing. So we're going to get them to read the first paragraph only in the article, just the first paragraph. Let's just remind ourselves what that reading looks like. So we're just going to get them to read this first part here so that they can answer this first one. If we feel comfortable, then we're going to let them work alone and go through the rest of this exercise. Now, what do we need to do next? They've gone through this exercise. They've decided whether these statements are true or false. What's the next thing we need to do? Of course, we need the feedback from the student. If you're not familiar with this term, in teaching when we talk about feedback, it's just getting the information back from the student. When you're eliciting, you're getting feedback. And when we ask for answers, the answers are the feedback. So we're going to get the feedback from the student, and I think it's a good idea to write true or false next to each of these statements. So when we come back to it, we can remember the information correctly. If your student's doing really well at this stage, instead of just getting the answers, we could push a little bit more, ask them for a bit more detail. For example, if we look here at E, people on the train were staring at Emma. This is true. So we could then also ask them why. Why were people staring at Emma? You just have to use your judgment. If you think your student is dealing with this well, just push a little bit more. So what's next? They've read the article, they've hopefully got the correct information, they've decided whether it's true or false. What do we need to do now? Well, first, before we can ask them to create sentences in the third conditional, it's a good idea to create sentences that aren't in the third conditional. So give them sentences that they can then convert. It's easier for them to work with existing sentences here. So we can help the student to make some sentences, not third conditional sentences, about what happened to Emma, using these statements as a guide. So the reason we wrote true or false next to these is so when we look at it, we know, is this sentence true or false? If it's false, like this one here, Emma liked her present job, we can get this sentence from it. Emma hated her job and looked for a new job. There's a why here. What did she do because she hated her job? What else do we have? She was just in time to catch her train. Emma was just in time to catch her train. Now this one's true, so we can directly take this sentence. So we want to get some sentences here that the student can then use to change into the third conditional. We're always giving students building blocks that they can use to produce something. We need to help them as much as possible, give them a structure to work within. So now we're going to have hopefully 5 sentences. I've put aim for 5 sentences here. Now that we've got our sentences, let's first work with the student, change the first sentence into the third conditional, like we did with the reading. We did the first example with them. It's always a good thing because it gives the student a clear idea of what you want them to do. As we're doing it, we could also review the structure, just remind them, like we did in the introduction. If Emma had liked her job, she wouldn't have looked for a new job. We can just stress the structure to them. You could do one example with them. If you think they're okay, then we're going to get the student and give them time to work alone, change the remaining sentences into the third conditional. If they're struggling, we could work on the first 2 sentences with them. Set them to work, give them time, and as always, when they're ready, we get the feedback. So we now want them to tell us what these sentences are if they're changed into the third conditional. We're doing the same thing here. We're slowly handing more control to the student. Now they're going to be speaking more than the teacher. And that's the goal of this stage, getting them to practice with this structure and figure out how to use this, get a bit more comfortable with it, so that in the production stage, they're more prepared to do what we're going to ask them to do. We've got this skeleton in our minds, the rough procedure here. Let's do what we did before and let's imagine that we're presenting to the student now. So let's plan how we're going to display this information on the screen and how we're going to help the student go through this section. Now we have our skeleton. We have a rough idea of what we're going to do in the practice stage. We kind of know our procedure. So now let's go back through that procedure and decide how we're going to do this. So not just the what, but how we're going to do it. If you think about the how before you go into your lesson, you'll be much better prepared and your lesson will flow more smoothly. So I'm not going to go through each of these again. Let's just get our steps. So the steps in our procedure on the page. And we'll work through them one by one to get an idea of how we're going to do this. So first thing, we're going to pre-teach. Just think about, again, why do we need to pre-teach? We're going to ask our student, so these are the teacher's notes, we're going to ask our student to read this article. So why might it be a good idea to pre-teach some vocabulary in advance? Just to better prepare them. We've looked through this. The teacher who designed this worksheet decided these might be problematic. This vocabulary might be new. So we're just going to make sure they're prepared and so they will understand the article better. So how do we do this? How are we going to give instruction to get them to go through this exercise? And just one thing before we go further. Because this is only 4 words, I'm going to go through this, or I would go through this with the student just in the lesson. I wouldn't prepare this in advance. I wouldn't send them the vocabulary the day before. If we were pre-teaching 10 words, for example, then I would probably send those the day before the student to give them some time to get ready. Therefore, we're not going to spend a lot of time going through this in the lesson. It can get a bit tedious plodding through vocabulary as you pre-teach it. But here we've just got 4 words. So how are we going to get our student to do this? Well, let's just keep it really simple. We can show the page when we're screen sharing. We can use our cursor. Vocabulary. Number 1. Match the... and just do what we did before. Lead them in, read the first couple of words, and they'll start to understand that you want them to finish this. If they don't, try again. Number 1, match the word. They will get it. Then go through. Read. Cover. Per. And after this, you can just stop. Just point your cursor and they'll read these words. Trust me, they will do it. Lead them in the first couple of words and they'll carry on reading. I may even hear say, how many words? And they're going to say 4. How many sentences? How many missing words in each sentence? And they're going to tell you 1. The more you get them to tell you about this exercise, the more they'll understand it and they're going to be ready to do it. So we can say, okay, A, you write, same thing, get them to finish this. Process of elimination, they'll get this one. Just a little hint, if a student gets really stuck on one of these, or any exercise that you're going through, don't just stick to the first one. If they really get stuck, just move to the next one and then come back to this one later. By the time they've eliminated some more answers, they'll be able to get this one. I'd do the first one together and then B, move, same thing. And by the time you get to C, don't even read it, just C and then D. We lead them in and then slowly hand over control to the student. And that's it. That's the pre-teaching done. Keep it really simple and we just work through it, guiding the student. Like I said, if there were more words, 10 is a fairly average number that you will have, especially for a reading exercise. And I would definitely send that vocabulary to the student the day before. So now we've pre-taught, how do we get the student down here? So number 2, direct the student to the reading exercise. We're going to work through A, possibly B with the student. Just the same thing. We've got our cursor here on the screen. So when you're screen sharing, it's very easy to direct the student. Bring them down here. Reading. Exercise 2. Read the... It's the same thing. Do you see the repetition? If you stick to the same techniques, the student will eventually start to understand. Eventually, they'll probably just start reading without you even needing to prompt them. So once they've read through, I may do something like, how many sentences can you see? And they'll count and give you the number of sentences back. Things like this might seem very simple, but it's a really good way for you to find out if they're paying attention. For example, if you say how many sentences and they say 4, you know they're looking at the wrong exercise. So if they give you the right number, they're looking at the right exercise. And we said here, we're going to do the first one with them and get them to read the first paragraph only. So think about, before I tell you how I would do it, how would you do this? How would you help the student to answer this first one, to find out whether the first statement is true or false? Well, I'd just do it something like this. I'd just say, A, read. Emma, get them to read it, and then say true or false. And at this point, I know the student won't know. So then I'll show them. So I'll change. I'll go to the reading and I'll say, read paragraph 1. I'll give you 1 minute. Read paragraph 1. Get them started. Get them to read this first paragraph. When they finished, we just go back here to the worksheet. Okay, so Emma, get them to read again, true or false. And hopefully at this point, they give you the right answer. If they don't, get them to read the paragraph again. Just give them another chance. If they get really stuck, because we have our cursor and we're screen sharing, we can just give them a hint. You know, you could place your cursor strategically to try and guide them to the answer. But I think at upper intermediate level, they're going to get this. If you feel that your student's getting it, that they understand the exercise, then I would just say B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 5 minutes. Read the article, true or false, and let them work. Give them some time. If you still feel that they're struggling, you could just do one more with them, just to help them get going. So your student gets to work, and after the time is up, what do we do next? Yep, that's right. Number 3, we need to get feedback from the student. And we said here that we would write true or false next to each statement as we get the answer back. And you will understand why we're doing this a bit later. But I think it's good practice anyway to keep a record of the answers that we've got. So same thing, bring the student in. Okay, A, Emma liked, get them to read the sentence. True or false? And we're hoping they give us the right answer, and we can type an F next to this answer. The next one, lead them in again, but not as much. B, we don't even say true or false this time, and just wait for their answer. C, give them time to answer, and then we go through. So I'm not reading anymore, I'm just saying the number. G, H. We just lead them in, help them with the first examples, and then slowly we take a back seat, let the student take control. We give them those examples to show what we expect from them. So now we've got our answers. We've got this information from the worksheet. So what do we need to do now? What's the next step? So let's take a look at number 4. Help the student to make some sentences, not third conditional, about what happened to Emma, using the statements as a guide. So we're going to use these now to help the student create some sentences. So I think the best way to do this is let's take away our notes here on the left, and let's imagine we're looking at the screen and seeing what the student would see. Let's imagine we're in the lesson now. It doesn't have to be just like this, but I've got the worksheet on the left. It could be on the right. It doesn't matter. But I've got the worksheet on the left, so this is what the student can see. And on the right, I've got some space to type some information for the student. We've been through and we've got our true or false answers already. And now we said we want the student to start making some sentences. Let's bring them in here again. So Emma liked her present job. Okay, false. So did she like her present job? And by this stage, they should say no. Say, yeah, no, she didn't like her job. Emma hated her job. So what did she do? And they've already read through the article, so they should be able to give you something like this. Emma hated her job, so she looked for a new one. If they're a bit stuck here, we can just give them this first sentence if they can't do it themselves, just to show them what we want. And we'll repeat it again. We give them another stem. She overslept because... And this comes from the second one here. Emma overslept. So she overslept because she... And we hope the student is going to give us something like this. It does not have to be the same as my sentence here. Why have we given them these first 2 examples? Why have we worked with them for these first 2? It's exactly the same as before. We just want to show them what we expect, so that when we set the task now, when I say, okay, 5 minutes, 3 sentences about Emma's day. Go. We let them work. And when we come back, we take their sentences. You may get sentences back with some mistakes in them, and then you can use the techniques you learned about in the error correction section to help them to correct the errors. Remember to decide which errors are important and which are not important at this moment. And if you get sentences back that have some mistakes, you can decide whether you think those are important to cover right now or whether you can just leave them until later. Remember, the focus of your lesson is the third conditional. So that should be our focus. And now look at these sentences that we've got. Why have we gone through to get these sentences? Why did we set this as a goal? What can the student now do with these sentences? Yeah, we've set the student up for the next stage of the exercise. So the student can use these sentences now to change them into the third conditional. We've given them a starting point. I keep talking about giving them the building blocks. These are the building blocks that they need to work with the third conditional. So let's take a quick check back at our notes. And here we can see our next section. So 5, 6, and 7. Work with the student to change the first sentence into the third conditional. And then we're going to get the student to work alone and change the remaining sentences. So let's talk about that in more detail in the next video. Here's where we left off in the previous video. And before we go further and just wrap up this practice section, let's have a quick review of what we've done so far. So first, we pre-taught the vocabulary to get the student ready for the reading exercise. And then the student read the text and decided whether these statements were true or false. And we kept a record of this information, of their answers. And then we helped the student to take this information and to create these 5 sentences. And we did that so that the student has a base. They have something here that they can use to change into the third conditional. And just one quick thing that I wanted to mention. When you're going through an exercise like this, occasionally you might have a student who's really on the ball. They might pick things up very, very quickly, and you could just fly through these exercises. And what can often happen is you end up with an awkward 10 minutes or so at the end of the lesson when all the material is finished and you have nothing else planned. And you're suddenly thinking on your feet of how to fill up this last 10 minutes of the class. Because you can't just end the class 10 minutes early. The students paid for the full 60 minutes or the full 30 minutes. You need to keep teaching. So if that's happening and your student is really just flying through this, you can slow them down by asking them for more detail. So we know that people on the train were staring at Emma. We know this is true. You could ask your student why. Why were people on the train staring at Emma? Get them to find this information. Again, with this one here, Emma was worried what the interviewer would think of her. Ask the student, why was she worried about what the interviewer would think of her? And this will get them to just do a little bit more work, and it will slow them down. It's better for the student because you're challenging them. If something's really easy, it's not very beneficial. So you're making it harder for the student, making them work a bit harder to get more benefit from the exercise. And it's also going to help you to avoid that awkward period at the end of a class when all the material's finished and you've got nothing else planned. So what are we going to do now? If we think back to our procedure for the practice section, what do we need to do now? Well, the whole purpose here is to get the student now to change these sentences into the third conditional. So before I give you an idea of how I would do this, just have a think about it yourself. With everything you've learned so far, how can you now direct your student, at least help your student at the beginning, to change these sentences? And let's just begin with one as an example. How are you going to get them started? What I would do here is I would just ask them a question. So we know here that Emma hated her job, so she looked for a new one. But what if Emma had liked her job? Would she have looked for a new one if she had liked her job? And I can give the student just a stem like this, the start of a sentence to try to get them thinking. So if Emma had liked her job, she wouldn't... And just try to lead them in here. They might not get it at this point, but they might. They might be able to do this with a bit of help. And we have our first example. If Emma had liked her job, she wouldn't have looked for a new one. So she hated her job, so she looked for a new one. If Emma had liked her job, she wouldn't have looked for a new one. Okay. So let's look at the next one. And I'm speaking to the student now. This is how I would do this in the lesson. She overslept because she forgot to set her alarm. She forgot to set her alarm. What if she had set her alarm? She didn't forget. What if she had set her alarm? If she had set her alarm, she wouldn't... And you can point the student here to the word, just give them some help. If she had set her alarm, she wouldn't have... And help the student to complete this sentence. And here we can just drill the structure a little bit more. If Emma had liked her job, she wouldn't have looked for a new one. If she had set her alarm, she wouldn't have overslept. Now, at this point, I think this is a good time to actually introduce the name of this structure to the student. Because remember, up to now, we haven't even told them what this is. We're just introducing them to this idea and now letting them practice with it. So right now, I would do something like this. So this sentence, had liked, wouldn't have, would have, had eaten, had been. If she had set her alarm, she wouldn't have, would have, could have, had eaten, had been. These sentences are the third conditional. At this level, at upper intermediate, your student will already have learned about the first conditional and the second conditional. And they might even have seen the third conditional before, but not necessarily studied it. So they'll have an idea of what we're talking about here. And we can just go through this structure with them, try to point them to it. So, how do we make the third conditional? We use, and they will say if. We use if plus had set, had liked, had eaten, had seen. If plus past perfect. And then what do we have? Wouldn't, would, could, couldn't, might. And you're getting the student to complete all this. Plus past participle. Get them to read it again. So how do we make the third conditional? If plus... Get the student to read through this. Again, right now, it doesn't matter if they're still a bit confused. It's a lot of information. Imagine you're a native English speaker and all this is in Italian. We have to remember to put ourselves in the student's position. So if they still sound a little bit confused, don't panic. It's completely natural. This is why we're giving them a chance to practice. This is why they're having a lesson. It's very unusual to be introduced to something like this the first time and understand it perfectly in one lesson. It never works like that. They'll practice in this lesson, they'll try to produce in this lesson, they'll go away, revise it, they'll review it in a later lesson. It's not about getting it perfect in one class. So now that they understand the name of this now, we've introduced them to the name of this structure and we've given them a basic idea here. We've told them how to construct the third conditional. We can now instruct them to complete this exercise. So 1, 2, 3. Change these sentences into the third conditional. If, past perfect, would, could, might have, plus past participle. 1, 2, 3, change into the third conditional. 5 minutes, go. And that's it. We've set the student off. We've given them 2 clear examples, and we've also given them the name and how to make this grammatical structure. And what's next? So we let the student work. What do we need to do next? As always, we need to get the feedback. So after the student has had some time to try to convert these sentences into the third conditional, we'll get some feedback from the student. So we could even begin something like this. Okay, so people stared at Emma because she wore slippers on the train. What if she hadn't worn slippers? If she... Well, just get your student started with this answer. And we can do the same for the others also. And when they give us the sentences, we can write them down, or we can type them out. At this point, you may well get some mistakes. So for example, if the student says to you, if she haven't wear slippers, if she didn't wear slippers, we know, if we remember what we talked about in our error correction lesson, we need to correct this because it's the key. This is the key vocabulary. And we can do it by pointing them back here, pointing them to the structure. Emma had liked. If she had set. If she haven't. Had. If she haven't worn. And the student will pick up that they've made a mistake. But we have to remember to only correct things that are relevant to the goal here. If your student here has spelt slippers wrong, it's not important right now. The point here is the third conditional. And now we've got our sentences. And I've just put this here in brackets just to let you know you need to accept whatever type of English they give you. Got is British English, gotten is American English. Not important in your lessons, whether they use American English or British English, Australian English. Don't try to push them towards one type of English. If they want to use American English, let them use it. If they want to use British English, let them use it. So now that we've got our sentences and we've been through and we've corrected some of the mistakes here, now I think it's a chance for us to get them to think a bit more deeply before we move on. So I might say something like, did these things happen? Did she like her job? If Emma had liked her job, did she like her job? And here the student's going to say no because they understand we already got this here. She didn't like her present job. Did she set her alarm? No. Did she wear shoes? No. And we're going to go through this, get them to think about, did these events actually happen? So why do we use the third conditional? Why do we use these sentences? To talk about things that did, and try to see if your student can pick up why we use these. I'd finish with something like this. Okay. We use the third conditional when we are talking about, get them to read this. We're using our imagi. And so now we've given the student a chance to practice. We've told them the name of the structure. We've told them how to make it. We've helped them to make it. And we've also explained why we use it. They're not going to retain all this information perfectly, but at least we've given them this information now. They can screenshot this, they can review it at a later date. So now that we've planned this, we've really decided how we're going to deliver this to our student in the best way possible, to give them the best possible chance of being able to use the third conditional. We need to go back to our notes. Because if you remember in the presentation stage, we said that like this much information is too much for a lesson plan. We're just writing this much detail now because we're thinking about how we're going to do this. It's a great idea to break it down like this, but it's no good having a lesson plan with this much information. It's too difficult to try to find out where we're up to. What we need to do now is to condense this and put it on our lesson plan in a way that makes it really easy to follow when we're in the lesson. So here's our lesson plan again for a very bad day. We have our warmer, we have our presentation. So now let's add the practice notes here. So number 3, practice. Pre-teach the key vocabulary in order to help them comprehend the text. The student then reads the text. We can work on the first answer or paragraph together. Then we get the feedback. Are these statements true or false? Create sentences from the statements to describe what happened to Emma, and we can help to get the student started. And we then change the sentences into the third conditional. Emma didn't like her job. If she had liked her job, she wouldn't have looked for a new one. And at this point, we can elicit the structure from the student. We can drill the structure by introducing it and the name here of the third conditional. And then after we set them the task, we get the feedback, and we can try to elicit why we use the third conditional. And there we go. That's our practice session planned and ready to go. So now we've done the practice session, the student is ready for the production. And in the next video, let's talk about the procedure for the production stage. And here we are in the final stage of the lesson. We've done all the hard work in the presentation stage and the practice stage, preparing our student for the production stage of the lesson. And it's here that we'll find out whether we've done our job correctly, because if we prepared and delivered the presentation stage correctly, and we also prepared and delivered the practice stage correctly, then this stage, the production stage, should be straightforward because we've done all the hard work getting ready for this. If your lesson doesn't work here, if the production stage is problematic, more likely than not, we've done something wrong. We got something wrong in the presentation stage or in the practice stage. So before we talk about what we're going to do in the production stage, I just want to have one final reminder about why we are doing the things that we're doing. It's so important to keep this in mind. If you can really understand why you're doing the things you're doing as a teacher, it will make you a better teacher. It will enable you to plan lessons more successfully. So we talked about this before. If we want the student to produce something in English or in the target language, if you're an Italian teacher, it's exactly the same thing. If you want the student to produce something in Italian, we must first give them all the building blocks that they need so they can build the language. You can't just throw a task at the student and expect them to do it. We always have to prepare them for it. If the student can't do a task, it's our fault. We didn't properly prepare the student for that task. And we did this right at the beginning. We thought about our goal. Before we even started planning, we got a rough idea of the goal of our lesson. We knew that we wanted our student to be producing something using the third conditional, and we said that it was going to be speaking. So they're going to be telling us about something using the third conditional. And then we worked backwards and started to plan our lesson. And if you do it this way, if you think of the goal of the lesson, like that goal that we had, think of that as a building that we want our students to construct at the end of the lesson. In order to do that, we need to pull that building apart. Once we've decided what that production activity is going to be, we need to pull it apart. And then as the lesson goes on in the presentation stage, the practice stage, we're giving those pieces, those blocks back to the students, but we're doing it in a way that allows them to see how to put them back together again. Imagine you're showing somebody how to make a building, a really simple building. We imagine the finished building and we pull it apart. We take off the chimney, we take off the roof, we remove the walls, take the windows and the doors out of the walls. We lift up the foundation. Now, we wouldn't give them the chimney first if we're teaching somebody how to put that back together again. We're not going to talk about the chimney first. We'd introduce the foundations first, then the walls, then we'd put the windows and the doors in, and then we might leave it up to the student to figure out how to put the roof and the chimney back on. That's what we're doing here. We're trying to give the students the information, these building blocks back in a logical order that's going to make sense to them. And this is why we take time to make a lesson plan. Because a good lesson plan helps you to make sure that you're giving your student the correct building blocks for them to be able to produce the target language in the final stage of the lesson. Do you remember right at the beginning of the course, I asked you the question, can you teach without planning your lesson? I hope that makes more sense to you now. Imagine trying to do everything that we've done here, like in the moment, thinking on your feet. How sure could you be that you're giving your student everything they need to be able to now use the third conditional successfully? That's what your lesson plan does. It makes sure that you're giving the student everything they need to get ready for this stage of the lesson. And it will also therefore help you if the lesson goes wrong. You can look back at your lesson plan and you'll be able to figure out, most of the time it's the teacher's fault. I realized that after I'd been teaching for a while. You might leave a lesson sometimes feeling frustrated and angry. Your student just made a mess of the final stage of the lesson. In the production stage, they just couldn't do anything. But with some reflection, if you look back at your lesson plan, you'll probably realize that it was your fault. You missed something out. They were confused because the teacher didn't do their job correctly. So with that in mind, let's now go on and talk about the procedure that we're going to go through in this section. There's not really a lot on the worksheet here. We already decided this is going to be a speaking activity, and we're going to follow the same format. We want the student to talk about a bad day that they had. It makes sense. Why change the topic now? If we suddenly ask them to talk about something totally different, it might be confusing. So what's our procedure going to be? Now, bearing in mind that this could be the first time your student has ever used the third conditional. Up until this lesson, they might not even have known that the third conditional exists. So what could we do now? What could we do now to help them, just to jog their memory? What might be a good idea? Well, I think a quick review here of the third conditional would be a good idea. Nothing intense. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. We're just going to flash their memory again. Just give them another look at how to make this. Refresh them again. Ask them why we use it. And that's it. No more than a couple of minutes. We just want to make sure that they're ready for this stage. And then, like we've done before, if we want the student to produce something, we always need to give them some kind of example. It's like the building blocks example works for the whole lesson, but it's also in the individual stages. If we want the student to do something now, we need to give them the right building blocks to get them ready. So I think we're going to present an example of the production to them. The teacher should talk about their bad day. So if it's me, I'm going to talk about a bad day that I had. And I'm going to use the third conditional in my example. I'll get the student to read through it, and I'll elicit some information from the student to make sure they understand what it is. So what is it they're reading? What is it talking about? Does it use the third conditional? Why do we use the third conditional? Just get the student to understand what it is they're reading, because this is a framework that they're going to use to then talk about their bad day. We're always getting the student ready. So next, we're going to give instructions correctly, and we're going to get the student to write about their bad day. After here, you see I've put a maximum of 5 events or 5 situations. It's always a good idea to give your students some kind of limit, some kind of goal to aim for. If you don't here, think about what might happen. They might write about one thing, and they don't understand. Oh, sorry, I thought you just wanted me to write one thing. You need to let them know exactly what you expect. If they write about 4 things, it's okay. If they write about 6, it's okay. But we're just giving them something to aim at. And we make it clear through our example in part 2 that they must use the third conditional. And we're going to, again here, we need to give them a time limit. You have to decide in your lesson how much time you have left in the lesson, how well you think your student is going to cope with the task, and give them an appropriate time limit. So the student's going to work on this, and then what do we need to do next? As always, we're going to get the feedback from the student. So in this case, the student is going to read from their notes. They're going to tell us about their bad day. And what do we need to do when we're listening to this? If the student makes a mistake, should we interrupt them? Of course not. We talked about this early in the course. We're just going to listen, make some notes, and we're only going to correct errors connected to the third conditional. If they mispronounce a word, like if they're talking about the train station and they say the train station, that doesn't matter. But if they say, if I haven't been late, I won't have, then we know we need to step in, use our error correction techniques, send the error to them and help them correct this. There's one more thing that I think we should do here, that we should add to our procedure, just to wrap up the lesson nicely. Can you think of anything that we could do right at the end here to wrap up our lesson? I'd have just a really simple final review. What did you learn about today? Just ask the student this question. What did you learn about in today's lesson? What did we do in today's lesson? And hopefully they can tell you we learned about the third conditional. And you could ask them again, so and why do you use the third conditional? Just by asking this, it's just reinforcing everything they've learned, and it's a nice way to finish off the lesson. And that's it. So do you see what I mean about this should be more simple? We've done the bulk of the work in the previous sections. If you've done that right, this section, the production stage, should be much more simple. So now we've decided our procedure. Let's think about how we're going to show this, how we're going to display this information and guide the student through this stage. This is where we left off in the previous video. So we walked through our procedure and we decided what we need to do in this final production stage of our lesson. Now let's take a look at how we're going to show this to the student on the screen and how we're going to guide them through this final stage. So here we are. This is what your student is going to see in the lesson. Now we said that we're going to have a quick review first of the third conditional, and we said that it needs to be simple. So can you think of how we could do that? What's the easiest way we can get this information from our student, get them to talk about the third conditional? I just asked them a question here. Type this on the screen, or you can ask this verbally. You don't always have to type these out, but I'd get them to read this. How do, and see what your student can tell you. If they're a bit stuck, give them an example sentence. If I hadn't become a teacher, I wouldn't have met you. Something like that. And see what you can get from them. If they get a bit stuck, give them something to work with. Now I've taken this directly from the worksheet. If you can do things like this, do it. Make your life easier. I just cut this out of the worksheet and I'd use this with my student. Get them to read here. If I'd, I would, and then go through the structure with them. I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, every part. It's just a refresher. The student can use this after the lesson to review. Remember, the goal here is not to get them to be masters of the third conditional or whatever you're teaching and understand every single detail perfectly. We're just introducing it to them for the first time in this lesson, and they'll review it again in the future and they'll perfect it eventually in time. And what else do we need to ask them? So here we've asked them, how do we make it? We also need to know, why do we use the third conditional? Another good question. And see what they can tell you. If they get stuck, you could also give them a clue, or you could write something like this, get them to read. We use, and just stress these parts here. events that didn't happen. Okay, we use the third conditional to talk about events in the past that didn't happen and get them to read again. These are just my examples. You can write sentences in your own way. We use our and get the student to read here and just highlight the important parts. These things didn't happen. It's our imagination. And we can give them some further examples just to hammer the point home, just one final reminder. This really happened. I was late. And as always, just get the student to read this. Stress the differences here. Really happened. Imagination. Was late. Hadn't been late. Was angry. Wouldn't have been angry. And that's it. That's the review. I'm not going to go into any more detail here. This should take a couple of minutes at the most, and then we can move on. And what was next? What did we say we need to do next? Remember about getting the student ready, giving them the building blocks. So if we want them to talk about their bad day, we're going to talk about our bad day first. So the teacher is going to talk about their bad day. You will talk about your bad day. And why are we doing this? What's the point? We're giving the student an example of what we want from them. I would go through this. I might read the first one and then get the student to take over. So yesterday, I fell over in the street because I wasn't paying attention. So this really happened. Yesterday, I fell over in the street because I wasn't paying attention. What if I had been paying attention? I can use the third conditional. If I had been paying attention, I wouldn't have fallen over. And here you can stress with your student. Did this really happen? Did this really happen? No, this is imagination, this sentence. And this is the third conditional. One situation, reality, imagination. And then I'd go through, maybe get the student to read from now on. Later in, just lead them in, get them to read. Introduce the third conditional sentence, next situation. And go through all of your sentences, making sure your student understands this is the reality, this is the imagination with the third conditional. Ask them now, how many situations? 1, 2, get them to count these situations. And then what we need to do, show this to the student so they know now this is talking about them. So here I've imagined my student is called Mark. If your student is called Sarah, this will be Sarah's bad day. You can ask them, is this my bad day or your bad day? And they will understand it's their bad day. Read, yes, if. Okay, so how many situations here? 1 situation. Reality and that's it. Guide them through. Do the same with each of these. Go through with all of these stems. Make sure they understand. This is what happened. This is the third conditional, the imagination. How many situations? 1. Whose bad day? Just reinforcing their understanding. Okay, 5 minutes. Write about your bad day. 5 situations, your bad day. Reality, imagination, third conditional. Go. And let the student work. And just a quick note, why have I done this? Why have I given them these like stems here? What do you think could happen if I don't give them this? They might spend a lot of time just thinking how to get the sentence started. Here, I'm just helping them to get going, to tell them, okay, we're going to think about yesterday. Here's later in that day. Just giving them a bit of structure so they're not too worried about it and they can focus more on the grammatical, on the third conditional, not worrying about the entire sentence. I find this works. Always, if you can, try to give your student a framework to work within. Give them some limits, some boundaries. It will help them. And then when your student comes back, what do we need to do? Listen. That's all we need to do. Okay, tell me about your bad day. Get a pen and paper ready, listen to what they say, and write down only the mistakes that are relevant to your target language. If they talk about travel here, they were traveling somewhere yesterday and they say train station, do we need to correct that? No. But if they say, if I haven't took the train, then we write that down. So let them speak, don't interrupt them, write down any relevant mistakes, and then after, use your error correction techniques, help them to correct the mistakes. Whatever happens, be positive here. Congratulate them, tell them well done, because they've just done something extremely difficult in another language. Even if they get every sentence wrong, we still say, well done, good work today. And before we move on, don't forget to ask them that one final question. What did you learn today? What did we talk about in the lesson? One final bit of reinforcement, just reminding them of what we've been doing. It's also a really nice way just to wrap up the lesson. And that's it, the lesson's done. Here's the reward for you as a teacher. Teaching is really hard work. You spend a lot of time planning lessons, preparing materials. In the lesson, you have to use a lot of energy. It can be quite stressful and frustrating. But in this section, when you hear your student using the new language correctly, and you remember that just 50 minutes ago they didn't know how to use this, you've helped them to improve. And this is where the satisfaction comes in. If we do this correctly, the student leaves the lesson feeling good, and you leave the lesson feeling satisfied that you've done your job correctly and you've helped this person towards their goal of using the English language or whatever their target language is. And now we just have one more thing to do before our lesson plan is complete. We need to condense the procedure, the notes that we made, and put them onto our lesson plan so they're easy to follow in the lesson. So this was our procedure, not as much as in the previous stages. As we said, this should always be a bit shorter. If we've done our job properly before, there shouldn't be as much to add at this stage. And here was our lesson plan. So we had our warmer, our presentation, the practice, and on the next page, we can add our production. Quick review of the third conditional, what and why. Give the student the example of my bad day, so the teacher's bad day, and then elicit the details. 5 situations, reality, and then imagination with the third conditional. Give the skeleton of the student's bad day. So remember, we gave them those sentence stems to get started. 5 minutes or however many minutes you decide to complete the task. Feedback, correct errors as needed. And then we finish with a general review. What did you learn today? And that's it. That's our lesson plan complete. And now we're ready to meet our student in the lesson. Now that we have our new skills and we know how to plan our lessons, it makes sense now to actually start to think about where are we going to go and find work? Where can we earn a living as an online English teacher? So I'm going to share some information with you, talk about some platforms that I know of, some of which I've used, others that I haven't used, but I know a little bit about, just to give you a chance to get started, to get your foot in the door. One thing I'm not going to talk about is working completely independently as an online teacher. So like making your own website, marketing yourself, getting 100% getting your own students. That's something I've never done, and I don't have experience, so I don't feel comfortable trying to give you advice about that. What you can do is go on YouTube, go on Google, and just search for information about that. There are lots of people out there doing it, and lots of people who'll be willing to give you advice. What I'm going to talk about are online platforms for teachers. The reason I use these is because they take away all the hard work in marketing yourself. Once you're accepted onto one of these platforms, the students come to these platforms to look for teachers. So you don't have to go out and look for students. They come to you. And especially some of these sites like italki and Verbling that we're going to talk about, you have thousands and thousands of students using these sites. So you, in my experience, you have no trouble getting a full schedule as a teacher. So let's start talking about italki here. So this is the one I would say I have the most experience with. I currently use italki. I've taught just about 1,000 lessons now online with italki. The way it works is you apply, and there are two ways that you can apply with italki. You can work as a community tutor, or you can work as a professional teacher. The difference being that if you want to work as a professional teacher, you have to have certification. So you have to have a TEFL certificate or a CELTA certificate to be accepted. If you don't have certification, you can apply to be a community tutor. The trade-off there is that if you're a community tutor, the students will expect to pay you less money because they know that you don't have official qualification. You still might be a really good teacher, but you don't have the certificate to back that up. But what it will do as a community tutor is just allow you to get on the platform, get your foot in the door, and get the experience you need. And at the same time as doing that, you can be working your way towards getting certified. But whichever way you do it, if you become a professional teacher or a community teacher, the setup is the same once you're inside italki. So you'll create a profile video where you can advertise yourself to the student, talk about your teaching style, how you're going to help the students. And then you have complete control over your schedule. So you can say exactly when you want to work. You can set time aside every day at specific times that suit you. As far as I'm aware, there's no minimum, and the maximum would be 24 hours a day. You could open your schedule up completely. And you also have control over the lessons you want to teach. So you can offer specific lessons. You could just say general English, or you can offer lessons using video from famous TV shows. You could have a whole series of lessons on Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, whatever you want to do. You can offer reading lessons based on a certain newspaper. You can set up the lessons that you want to offer, and the students can then see those lessons on your profile and decide if they're interested in learning with you. And then what they'll do is check your schedule, find a time that suits them, and they book a lesson in advance. I think the minimum, or the cutoff point, is 12 hours in advance. That's the minimum. I think you can change it if you want to, but then it gets quite difficult. You could have a student booking a lesson while you're asleep in the middle of the night, and then you wake up and you've had no time to plan. I usually have mine to at least 12 hours notice. But that means you have a fixed schedule, so you can look ahead and see exactly how many lessons you have each day. And when you're teaching on here, you can use Skype, or you can use Zoom, Google Hangouts to deliver your lessons. Or you can also use italki's classroom. They have their own classroom, so they give you a lot of flexibility. A lot of these platforms don't want you to take the students outside their platform. And in my experience, I've never had trouble finding students on italki. It goes up and down. Sometimes it's very busy. Sometimes it goes a bit more quiet. But you usually have a lot of students booking lessons with you. The downside to italki is the way they pay. They charge a 15% commission on your lesson. So if you charge $10 for your lesson, and you have complete control over the price. Most teachers seem to set their lesson between $10 and around about $20 per hour per 60 minutes. And if you set your lessons to $10, italki takes 15%, so you'll get paid $8.50, and that's a 15% flat fee. And then they pay out twice a month, and there are certain cut-off points. So I think it's the 15th and either the 25th or the 26th of each month. So if you put in your withdrawal request on the 14th, then you'll go into the 15th payout. But then you have to wait it's usually about another 10 days to actually get the money. It's a very slow process. You can pay $10 to get your money within 48 hours. So if you want to get your money more quickly, you have to pay a bit more. But that starts to add up then. You're paying 15% commission on every single lesson, or you're paying a 15% fee to italki on every lesson. Then if you want to pay another $10, it might not sound much, but on top of everything else, it can seem a bit unfair at times. You're paying to get your money, but that's just the way it is. The plus of italki is they have a huge student base, so you'll never have trouble finding lessons on there, finding students. The downside is their payout method, I would say, is a bit stingy and it's quite slow to get your money. The other platform I would recommend next is Verbling. I switched from Verbling to using italki when I moved from Europe to Asia. When I lived in Europe, I got a lot more lessons on Verbling, not so many on italki. Since moving to Asia, I get more lessons on italki, not so many on Verbling. I've actually stopped using Verbling because it's just not worth it. I hardly get any students at my current location. So I guess it depends on where you live in the world. The only downside at the moment to Verbling is that they're not currently accepting new teachers. I think during the pandemic, a huge amount of people have started to work online, and I guess they've had a lot more people applying to teach online. It's worth checking back because it is a really good platform to use. They do require you to be certified though. There is no community tutor option on Verbling. You must prove that you have a TEFL certificate or a CELTA certificate. It's the same as italki in as much as they have a large student base. So you generally have no trouble finding students and getting lessons on your schedule. As I said, for me, Verbling was much better when I was in Europe. So I'm not sure why that was. It might just be coincidence, but it seemed to be much more effective in Europe. The one of the big pluses compared to italki is Verbling, the way they pay out. Unless they've changed it, they pay out. If you work from Monday to Sunday, the cutoff point is the Sunday evening, and they pay out on Monday. And it's usually within 24 hours, and you don't have to pay any extra money to get your money. Verbling also charges a 15% commission, so it's the same. You have the same flexibility to set your schedule, set your lesson prices, decide what kind of lessons you want to offer to the students, but they charge you a fee for every lesson. That's just what you have to do to be able to use their platform and to be able the convenience of having a large amount of students coming to you instead of looking for students. So they charge a 15% fee also. The next one I would recommend, and this would be really for somebody who isn't qualified. You have no certification, no experience. You're going through this course and you just want to get started. This one here, Cambly. I have an account with Cambly, but I've never used them. But the reason I'm recommending it is because here we say no teaching certificate, you don't need a degree, and you don't need any experience. The setup with Cambly is a little bit different. Unlike Verbling and italki, where students book specific lessons with you. So a student might book a reading lesson with you on Monday between 9 to 10. Another student on Monday might have a listening lesson from 11 till 12, and you know in advance who you're going to be teaching. You can find out about their level. You can plan in advance. What Cambly does is you set your availability on your schedule, and then you're just available during that time. Students don't book in advance. So you sit down at your computer. If you said you're going to be available from 9 a.m. until 2 p.m., you sit down at your computer at 9 a.m., webcam on, microphone ready, and a student will see which teachers are available and they'll request a lesson there and then. So you don't know who you're going to be teaching in advance. You've no time to prepare. The positive to that is they usually just want conversation classes. So they just want to practice talking. Here it says here, get paid to chat with people from around the world. So these students aren't really expecting a structured lesson. But what it will allow you to do is just get used to talking to students. You can put some things in practice. You can still help students to correct errors, for example. From my memory, students, if they like you, can then request lessons with you in the future. So they can request specific lessons. They want an hour with you. So I do think it can lead to more structured lessons. But the great thing about this is it will just get you started and get your foot in the door. I'm not 100% sure about their payment. You get paid for your talk time. And I think it works out round about $10 per hour. So it's not fantastic. It depends where you live in the world. But as I said, it'll just allow you to, get your toes wet, just experience what it's like trying to help a student. So the last one that I'll mention here is another platform called Preply. This is another well-known platform. I have used Preply. The reason I stopped using it is because on platforms like italki and Verbling, they allow you to offer a trial lesson. So it's usually 30 minutes. You charge a small fee. It's like $5 or $6. Gives students a chance to get to know you, ask you any questions, and it kind of gives you a chance to display your personality, your teaching style to the student. It's a bit more informal than a normal lesson, but it's just a good chance to attract students with a cheaper fee. Preply doesn't work like that. Preply, they expect that every new student gets the first lesson for free. So Preply takes 100% of the commission every time you teach a new student. And you only start earning from that student if they book another lesson with you. And I think the more lessons you have with the same student, the less commission Preply takes. But they take 100% commission on that first lesson. For me, I don't know, that's not great for me. This is a very popular teaching platform. A lot of people use it, so people do have success with it. And I just thought I'd mention it here because it's one of the more well-known ones. So those were the options that I'd say get started with. You can obviously Google for online teaching platforms, best place online to teach. And there are so many out there, too many for me to mention in one video. If you don't have any experience at all, maybe you're still a bit nervous about getting started, I'd go with something like Cambly because it's a bit more informal and it'll just get you in there, get your foot in the door, get used to dealing with students, and you can at least practice some of the skills we've talked about. You can certainly practice error correction with the student here in a bit more of an informal atmosphere. If you have certification, Verbling once they're offering, once they're taking on teachers again, italki, I think overall is probably the best one because they give you the option of being a community tutor or a professional teacher. So it works really well for people who have qualifications and people who don't. You can get started either way. And it's really flexible. You can set your schedule. You can decide what lessons you want to teach to the students. You can set your own prices. And it's a huge marketplace. There are so many students there. And I've never had any problem finding students here. So those would be my recommendations. Whichever one you choose, I wish you the best of luck. And I genuinely hope that you find success working online as a teacher.